A quiet sea, above Wano, drifting into Kaido's world. High above Wano, the night settles like a heavy cloak, and the sea that surrounds the closed country lies strangely still, its usual tempests muted into a slow, rhythmic breathing beneath the moon. Clouds drift in long, lazy strands over Onigashima, their shadows gliding across the jagged horns of the island, across the dim lanterns of sleeping ships, and across the distant, half-formed silhouette of something that looks, at first, like a dragon wrapped around a fortress. It is quiet enough that even the creak of old wood and the soft wash of waves feel careful, as if the world itself were trying not to wake the guardian that sleeps within that shape. The island's outline is familiar now, yet in this hour it feels less like a base of operations and more like a living figure, an ancient beast that rose from the sea and allowed a castle to be built upon its back. From certain angles, the skull dome becomes a crown, the jagged rocks become scales, and the great iron chains that anchor Onigashima to the sky resemble the bindings of some bound deity of war. Tonight, we walk slowly through that illusion, through the way a place and a person can blur together, until the idea of Kaido is as much landscape as character, as much natural disaster as individual will. Within this world of pirates and marines, of revolutionaries and kings, there exists a hierarchy of strength that no one has ever written down, yet everyone quietly obeys. It is not the bounty posters on tavern walls, not the ranks sewn onto marine coats, but a deeper ordering of power, where certain names are spoken as if they were weather patterns, or fault lines, or distant sleeping volcanoes. Some are called legends, some are called monsters, and a rare few are spoken of as if they have stepped beyond the simple category of human altogether. Kaido belongs to that last, uncomfortable tier. He is not merely introduced as the strongest pirate, not filed neatly beside Whitebeard, Shanks, or Big Mom, but described instead as the strongest creature, a title that sounds less like a boast and more like an admission that language has failed. It suggests something the world struggles to define, something whose body has turned execution into spectacle, whose skin has rejected spears, swords, and hanging ropes until death itself seems almost embarrassed to keep trying. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, and that uncertainty is part of the weight his name carries. Before you drift into sleep, this video will move at a calm, steady pace through Kaido's body, his feats, and the mythic presence that gathers around him like storm clouds around a mountain peak. We will use the familiar idea of a strength list, but instead of racing from name to name, we will circle one overwhelming figure, measuring him softly against the other giants of this era and the last. To understand why he stands at this peak, we will quietly touch the bodies, powers, and limits of beings like Whitebeard, Big Mom, the ancient giants, and the regenerating elders of the world government, letting their extremes become gentle measuring sticks pressed against Kaido's inhuman durability and the deeper truth of their nature. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and let the sea above Wano stay calm as we begin. The hidden ladder of monsters, framing strength in one piece. From that quiet surface, we can begin to look downward, because in the world of One Piece, there exists a hierarchy of strength that is almost never spoken aloud, yet is felt in every decision, every alliance, every tremor of fear that passes through a crowded port when certain names are mentioned. It is not a ranking printed in any official marine document, not a list carved into some ancient poneglyph, not even a chart the world government would ever dare to acknowledge. And yet the pattern is clear if you watch the story slowly. The Yonko who rule the seas with informal authority, the admirals who act as living weapons of the state, the ancient legends whose very absence shapes the balance of power, and the scattered beings who do not fit comfortably within the word human all occupy rungs on a hidden ladder, rising and falling as eras change, but always reminding you that the sea itself remembers who it should fear. Tonight, we walk slowly through that ladder in the gentle rhythm of a top 20, not to argue, not to shout, not to settle every debate that has ever kept forums awake at night, but to place a calm frame around Kaido's position among the giants of this world. Each name will arrive like a quiet tide, announced, considered, and then allowed to drift back, while Kaido remains in view as the reference point, the heavy shape on the horizon that refuses to sink. To do that, we first need to separate the language the story uses when it speaks about strength. Whitebeard was called the strongest man in the world, a title that wrapped his human frame, his quake fruit, and his legend into one coherent crown. Others are called the strongest swordsman, the strongest pirate, the strongest marine, each label tying their power to a role, a profession, a path they chose to walk. Kaido, however, is named the strongest creature, as if the narrative itself stepped back from the comfort of human categories and admitted that his body, before devil fruits, before titles, stands as an anomaly among anomalies. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth holding that distinction gently in your thoughts, because each of the 20 figures we will visit reveals a different facet of what strength can mean. Some embody raw destructive power, some unyielding endurance, some the quiet but terrifying authority to command the world, and some hint at stranger things entirely, like regeneration that defies logic or wills that bend reality around them. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the deeper truth of their nature will flicker through their feats. Kaido sits at the place where many of these threads meet, with a body that resists execution, a will that drags him back from defeat, and a form that the world itself began to classify as something other than man. As we descend this ladder, from visible emperors to hidden sovereigns, we will keep returning to a single, quiet question. What does it mean that out of every monster, hero, and godlike figure we can name, Kaido's body is the one the world could not break? Subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories, and let that question follow you softly into the next names on the list. Listening in the dark. How this list will guide you to sleep. As we begin to name those other monsters, the pace of the story will slow even further until each figure feels less like an entry on a ranking and more like a quiet stop along a nighttime road. Tonight, we walk slowly through 20 of the strongest presences in this world, from emperors who shook the seas in broad daylight to hidden authorities whose power was never meant to be seen, and each of them will become a soft mirror held up to Kaido's body, reflecting how strange his title of strongest creature really is. There exists a hierarchy of strength that most readers feel long before it is ever stated outright, and this list will simply trace that invisible ladder in a calm, deliberate way. We will move from the old era's titans, like Whitebeard who died standing, to the emerging monsters of the new age, like Luffy carrying the echo of Joy Boy. And at every step we will pause to notice how their endurance, their scars, and their limits compare to the one creature whose skin refused to break under execution, whose falls shattered the ground instead of his bones. The tone will remain soft and measured as we do this. There will be no sudden shifts in volume, no rapid-fire trivia that demands you keep up. Each name will arrive like a low tide, followed by a long, unhurried explanation of where they stand in the world's structure, how people speak about them, and what their bodies have already endured. Big Mom's iron balloon flesh, Whitebeard's final stand, Garp's aging yet terrifying fists, all of these will be described in the same steady voice, then laid gently beside Kaido's almost absurd resilience, so that the contrast settles in slowly rather than striking all at once. Before you drift into sleep, it may help to know that every character segment will follow a simple, repeating pattern, like a breathing exercise disguised as a story. We will begin with how the world sees them, the titles and rumors that surround their authority, then move inward to the deeper truth of their nature, the feats that show what their bodies can actually withstand, and finally return to Kaido, asking quietly what it means that even among such figures, his body occupies a different category. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, and that uncertainty will be allowed to remain calm and unresolved. You do not need to hold on to every detail. It is perfectly fine to drift in and out of attention, to let one admiral blur into one emperor, and then to rejoin the journey several names later without feeling lost. Because the list moves in one direction, always climbing toward the mystery of Kaido's nature, you can drop back in at any point and still feel the gentle ascent, the sense that each new comparison is another quiet weight added to the scale. At certain moments, we will pause to ask soft questions, not to wake you, but to give your mind something light to turn over. Where does strength come from in this world? From bloodlines, from will, from ancient fruits, or from the simple refusal to fall? What is the cost of a body that can survive 40 failed executions, a hobby of leaping from the sky, and battles against entire generations at once? If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, then let those questions drift to the back of your thoughts, because soon we will arrive at the first name on the list and the first quiet crack in the legend of the strongest creature alive. Before you drift off, a soft invitation to join the crew. The first quiet crack in the legend of the strongest creature alive. Before you drift into sleep, this is also a gentle place to mention something small, almost like setting a folded note at the edge of your pillow rather than placing a demand in your hands. If you find yourself returning to this kind of calm exploration, to nights where we trace the outlines of figures like Kaido and the deeper truth of their nature without raising the volume of your thoughts, you are welcome to subscribe for more calm, one-piece stories, not as an urgent task, but as a quiet marker that you might want to come back here again. There is no rush in this world we are walking through tonight, no timer counting down in the corner of the screen, only the slow recognition that there exists a hierarchy of strength, and an equally quiet hierarchy of support. If, at some point, you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, whether it's a crowded city apartment, a small room by a window where the streetlights paint the ceiling, a distant country on the other side of the sea, or a ship's cabin in your imagination, drifting across the calm belt. Those scattered places, whispered into the comments one by one, begin to feel like a crew that has fallen asleep at different posts under the same wide sky. These small signals carry more weight than they appear to, not in a loud algorithmic sense, but in the way they quietly allow this channel to keep making long, unhurried voyages like this one. When you subscribe or leave a line about the world outside your window, you make it possible to linger with a single figure for an entire night, to move slowly through Kaido's executions, his falls from the sky, his battles against entire generations, instead of rushing past him in a list that treats his body as just another number. In a story filled with ancient weapons, hidden authority, and monstrous power, that ability to take our time is its own kind of strength. But none of this needs to happen now. You do not need to reach for the screen. You do not need to sit up or blink yourself fully awake. It can wait until morning or the next evening when you remember that there was a quiet place that talked about Kaido as you fell asleep. Rest is the only thing that is even slightly urgent here, and even that arrives slowly in its own rhythm. So we will simply place that invitation on the table between us and leave it there, untouched, while the night continues. Tonight, we walk slowly through the world's strongest figures, one by one, and as we step away from the idea of Kaido as an isolated monster and back into the wider field of power, we can begin to set him beside the emperors, the admirals, the ancient sovereigns in the shadows, and see where the strongest creature truly stands when all the other giants of this story are finally allowed to enter the room. Rank 20, Katakuri, the disciplined future against Kaido's reckless flesh. And as all those giants begin to gather in your mind, there is a quiet figure standing near the lower steps of this invisible staircase, a man who does not shake the world with earthquakes or erase islands, but who instead represents something far more disciplined and precise. Tonight, we walk slowly through that hierarchy of strength, and at rank 20, we arrive at Charlotte Katakuri, the sweet commander whose body and mind have been sharpened until even time itself seems to hesitate around him. On the surface, his power is not loud. He is not an emperor, not a legendary pirate from the ancient age, not a celestial authority seated above the world. Yet among the New World's hardened crews, his name carries a calm kind of dread, because he feels like an undefeated wall that simply does not move. For years, his record remained spotless. No challenger could truly claim to have toppled him, and the way he fought, with that still, unflinching composure, made him seem almost inhuman to those who faced him, even though his body is, at its core, entirely human flesh. The deeper truth of their nature, his and Kaido's, only appears when you place them side by side. Katakuri has trained his observation haki to the point where he can see slightly into the future, watching the next few seconds unfold and then calmly adjusting his body, his stance, and even the mochi that makes up his transformed form, so that blows pass through him, slide off him, or meet only empty air. Where others harden themselves like shields, he becomes a river, flowing around attacks, reshaping his mochi body to avoid damage before it is ever truly dealt. This is a different kind of durability, an avoidance-based survival that depends on discipline, focus, and constant prediction. Kaido, by contrast, stands at the opposite extreme. He simply lets the world hit him. Swords shatter, clubs bounce, execution devices fail, and where Katakuri survives by never being in the path of the strike at all, Kaido survives by allowing the strike to land and trusting that his skin, his bones, and whatever ancient force moves through his frame will refuse to break. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the contrast is clear. Think back to Katakuri's long battle with Luffy in the Mirror World, a duel that stretched on and on until the ground itself was carved and cratered. Katakuri was pierced, knocked down, forced to confront his own image, yet again and again he rose, his willpower knitting his resolve back together even when his body could not quite keep up. Before you drift into sleep, imagine that same depth of stamina, that same refusal to yield, housed inside a body like Kaido's that barely seems to register damage at all. If Katakuri is the peak of human discipline, then Kaido begins to feel like the opposite, a creature whose natural baseline is so monstrously strong that discipline becomes almost optional. And as we climb higher from this quiet commander to the next figures on the list, that gap between earned perfection and effortless resilience will only grow wider. Rank 19, Doflamingo and the Strings That Couldn't Cut a Beast. From a man who refined his body through relentless discipline, we drift now to a different kind of monster, one who treats other people's bodies as nothing more than threads to be pulled and cut. In the quiet theater of Dressrosa, Don Quixote Doflamingo stood as both puppeteer and executioner, a figure who could turn a city into his stage and every living thing into a dangling marionette. Tonight we walk slowly through the nature of his power. The string fruit on paper sounds almost delicate, almost harmless, yet in his hands, those threads become invisible razors that can slice buildings, bisect opponents, and stitch the very sky into a cage. There exists a hierarchy of strength in this world, and Doflamingo sits high upon it, not only because of his cutting power, but because his own body has proven remarkably difficult to bring down. You can remember how, during the long night of Dressrosa, he absorbed blows that would have ended most pirates, his organs punctured, his spine rattled, his internal structure quietly collapsing. And yet, instead of falling, he did something both grotesque and strangely methodical. He reached inward with his strings, used them to literally sew his organs back together, to bind torn tissue, to hold himself upright like a puppet refusing to collapse. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the image it leaves is clear: a man who turns his own body into a repairable object. In many other tales, that would be the final monster. A warlord who commands underworld routes, who walks through bullets, who smiles while his insides are knitting themselves together, would stand as the apex predator in human form, the last obstacle before the curtain falls. His cruelty, his calm arrogance, and his refusal to stay down mark him as someone the world itself seems reluctant to erase. And yet, when you set that same figure beside Kaido, the contrast becomes quietly unsettling. Doflamingo survives because he can fix what is broken, because his mind is sharp enough and his strings are fine enough to improvise surgery in the middle of a battlefield. Kaido, by comparison, is a creature whose skin has turned the very concept of execution into a kind of dark comedy, whose neck has met blades and guillotines and simply refused to yield, not through clever stitching, but because the steel never pierced deeply enough to matter. Before you drift into sleep, you might sit with that difference for a moment. If Doflamingo's self-repair feels impressive, even horrifying, what does it mean that Kaido's body often does not need repair at all? That falls from the sky and city-shattering blows register as little more than surface scratches? Subscribe for more calm One Piece stories, and if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, as we move from this fallen kingpin to beings for whom even Doflamingo's resilience would look fragile. Rank 18. King of the Flames, a Lunarian shadow beside a dragon. And as you picture Doflamingo's threads snapping against Kaido's hide like wet string, the ranking carries you further into that quiet, rare air where even mentioning another body beside his feels almost like an exaggeration. Tonight, we walk slowly through one of the few exceptions, a dark-winged guardian who moves in the Emperor's shadow rather than in front of him. King of the Flames, the Lunarian perched at Kaido's right hand, is introduced to the story not as a loud conqueror, but as a silent executioner, a figure whose very silhouette seems wrong for this age. Black wings, obsidian armor, a calm, unblinking stare, and behind him an ancient fire that never quite goes out. His Lunarian heritage grants him a body that can endure bullets, explosions, and blades that would carve through most New World veterans without slowing. For most of the story's long history, Lunarians were spoken of in the past tense as a race that lived on the Red Line and vanished, and yet here is one, letting himself be set on fire, letting himself be riddled with gunfire, and treating it as little more than background noise. There exists a hierarchy of strength that is never written on any map, never declared in any formal treaty, and never openly acknowledged by those who benefit from keeping it hidden. And King's body sits high on that invisible ladder. The trade-off that defines his nature is simple to describe and strangely elegant to watch. When the flames on his back burn bright, his defense becomes almost impenetrable, turning Zoro's blades and Marco's blows into shallow marks, yet his movements grow heavier, slower, as though the fire is hardening into armor. When those flames dim, the opposite happens. His speed spikes into something sharp and predatory. His slashes cut the air itself, but each strike he receives begins to matter again. Even among the beast pirates, who are already a gathering of monsters, King is treated as something set apart, a relic of an almost erased race, a living fossil of an older, harsher world where fireproof skin and effortless flight were simply baseline conditions for survival. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether his resilience comes purely from bloodline, or whether the experiments in Punk Hazard and the quiet interest of the world government hint at deeper truths, remains one of those threads the narrative has not yet chosen to pull. What is clear is that bodies like his are meant to be studied, contained, or worshipped, not casually placed in the role of subordinate. And yet Kaido does exactly that. If King is a rare specimen, the last spark of an ancient skybound people, then Kaido is the one who looked at that rarity and decided it would stand beside him, not above him, a decision that quietly tells you where his own body resides on that same ladder. Before you drift into sleep, imagine Onigashima's night sky. Kaido's colossal dragon form coiling through the clouds, scales glowing with heat, and beside him, just within that storm of power, King's dark silhouette, wings spread, flames trailing, two monsters of durability, two violations of what a human frame should reasonably endure, sharing the same patch of sky, but only one of them spoken of by the world as the strongest creature alive. And if a Lunarian can be reduced to a shadow in that presence, what does that imply about the even stranger beings who do not serve Kaido at all, but stand outside his reach, watching? Rank 17. Marco, the phoenix that heals versus, the beast that endures. out beyond that shattered sky where Lunarian flames and dragon scales briefly touched, there exists a hierarchy of strength that expresses itself in very different bodies and in very different kinds of survival. One of the quietest examples of this, and one of the most beautiful, is a man who does not rule an empire, does not sit atop the world like a beast king, but drifts through battles like a calm guardian of the dead and the living alike. Marco the Phoenix moves as if the war around him is happening in another room, his eyelids heavy, his voice soft, his posture almost sleepy, yet when he chooses to act, his entire body dissolves into blue fire that does not consume, but restores. The mythical Zoan that defines his nature wraps him in flames that heal instead of burn, feathers of light tracing the outline of a man who has made peace with the idea of being hurt, because for him, hurt is not the end of the story, only a brief interruption. At Marineford, this truth was made visible again and again. Admiral-level blows, beams of light and magma, shockwaves that could shatter ships, crashed through his frame, and for a moment it looked as though the body beneath had been erased, reduced to a silhouette of scattered embers, only for those embers to gather, to thicken, to remember where his limbs belonged. For short spans of time, Marco felt functionally immortal, reforming from apparent destruction, returning to the air with a quiet inevitability that unsettled even hardened observers of the world's power. His strength, then, is not the refusal to be wounded, but the refusal to stay wounded. Marco can be pierced, crushed, even torn apart, yet the damage is gently rewound, the injuries unwritten, his phoenix form restoring him to fighting condition again and again, until his stamina, not his flesh, is what finally begins to fray. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth noticing how different this is from the monstrous endurance that defines the creature we are following tonight. Kaido's body, by contrast, often seems to have no interest in that kind of visible healing at all. Blows land, explosions bloom, blades ring against his skin, and still, when the smoke clears, his silhouette emerges almost unchanged, as though the world itself had bounced off some ancient, immovable shape. Where Marco glows with restorative fire, Kaido simply absorbs, his frame recording only a slow, cumulative wear that takes armies, Yonko, and a godlike Luffy to meaningfully deepen. If Marco is a symbol of rebirth through healing, a figure who accepts destruction so that he can quietly return from it, then Kaido is the symbol of a body so dense and reinforced that the world struggles to inflict meaningful wounds in the first place. One man rewinds damage, the other makes damage feel irrelevant. And yet, the deeper truth of their nature is that both point toward a question the story has only begun to answer. What happens when regeneration and raw durability are no longer rare gifts, but the baseline of the ancient monsters still waiting above them? Tonight, we walk slowly through that possibility as we move further up the list toward beings for whom even Kaido's frame may be only a starting point. Subscribe for more calm One Piece stories. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight and hold that image of blue flames against dragon scales as we step into the next layer of this quiet, terrifying ladder of strength. Rank 16, Mihawk's blade, and the question of what it cannot cut. And as we leave that image of blue fire licking harmlessly across dragon scales, the story leads us to a different kind of edge, not of flame, but of steel. In a world where there exists a hierarchy of strength that is often loud and explosive, there is one figure whose power is expressed in a single quiet line, a single perfect cut, drawn through the world like a piece of calligraphy. Dracula Mihawk, the man known as the strongest swordsman alive, does not need armies, fleets, or territories to assert his authority. His black blade, Yoru, has parted massive ships as if they were paper, has carved through frozen oceans with a motion so controlled that the sea itself seems to pause around it, and has demonstrated a precision that makes even distant observers fall still. Where others shout their power, Mihawk simply swings, and the world rearranges itself along the path of his sword. Within this quiet, terrifying simplicity lies the reason he matters to Kaido's body. Mihawk represents the pinnacle of cutting power in the story, the endpoint of a question that begins with every swordsman who has ever tried and failed to pierce something that should not be pierced. If there is an object, a fortress, or a living being that can be sliced, Yoru is the instrument most likely to reveal that truth, to draw a clean line between what can be divided and what must remain whole. So the mind drifts, before you drift into sleep, to a hypothetical that the story itself has never staged. If Mihawk's blade were raised on an execution platform, if Kaido were bound not by sea stone chains but by the quiet promise that this time the edge would be different, would the title of strongest creature still stand untouched, or would even his skin finally yield to the world's sharpest edge? The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, because it has never allowed these two extremes to meet. We know that lesser blades have shattered against Kaido's neck, that execution attempts have failed not because of mercy, but because steel and guillotine alike simply refuse to complete their task. Yet Mihawk's sword exists in a different category, a thing treated almost like an ancient authority in its own right, and still, Oda has chosen to keep that particular collision in the realm of late-night speculation, a sleep-friendly uncertainty rather than a settled fact. In that restraint, there is a kind of respect. Kaido's body sits at the edge of what the narrative has chosen to test, a wall we can see but have not fully measured, while Mihawk's cutting power stands as the chisel that has not yet been pressed against it. Tonight, we walk slowly through that gap between what is known and what is merely suggested, and as we move upward, the figures we meet will test Kaido's durability not only with blades, but with concepts that cut even deeper than steel. Rank 15. Fujitora and the weight of the sky on mortal bodies. From the sharp certainty of a blade, the narrative drifts now into something quieter and less defined, a pressure you cannot see, but that every living body feels. There exists a hierarchy of strength, not only in how hard a strike can land, but in how much of the world's quiet, constant weight a figure can carry before bone, will, or reason begins to bend. In that space stands Isho, better known as Fujitora, a blind admiral who moves through the world with a gambler's cane and a monk's restraint, speaking softly even as he holds the authority to drag the heavens downward. His public image is gentle, almost weary, yet with a tilt of his blade he can call down burning meteors or thicken the very air until gravity itself becomes a blanket of stone, turning open streets and battlefields into places where simply standing upright is an act of defiance against the sky. It is not just spectacle. When Fujitora increases gravity, he is performing a kind of quiet experiment on matter and on living forms alike, revealing the deeper truth of their nature without needing to say a word. Ships that once floated with ease begin to creak and splinter, buildings bow and then collapse in on themselves, and the ground spiders with fractures, as if the island's skeleton is confessing that it was never built for this kind of strain. Bodies respond in the same way. Ordinary people are pinned flat, unable to move, their lungs fighting for each breath as blood and organs are pressed downward, while stronger fighters find their joints protesting, their spines compressing, their muscles forced to fire at several times their normal effort just to lift an arm or take a step. Anyone who can still think clearly, still attack, still protect someone else beneath that multiplied pressure is quietly telling you something about their durability that no title can fully capture. Before you drift into sleep, you can think of Fujitora's gravity as a visible metaphor for something that has always been present in this world. The idea that true monsters are those who function normally under stresses that should break the frame. In that sense, his power becomes a measuring device, a way to see which figures possess bodies that are merely strong and which have crossed into something closer to the monstrous or the mythic. And this is where the bridge to Kaido appears, almost without effort. Fujitora reaches up and drags the sky downward. Kaido, by contrast, has spent a lifetime throwing himself down from the sky as if to see whether the planet will finally object. Every time he steps off a sky island, the earth craters, structures shatter, and yet his body rises again, as though gravity's harshest verdict has been delivered and quietly overruled. In a world where an admiral can weaponize weight itself, Kaido meets that same ancient pressure head-on, turning the fall that should end a story into a casual opening act. and the question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. Rank 14, Akainu, Magma Fists and the Limits of Burning Flesh. And from the pull of gravity, the story moves quietly back into the pull of heat, because in this world of shifting tides and ancient power, there exists a hierarchy of strength that is measured not only in how far someone can fall, but in how completely they can burn another away. Among the Marines, that role belongs to Sakazuki, better known as Akainu, a figure who seems carved from hardened magma and hardened belief, a relentless embodiment of absolute justice whose very footsteps feel like an argument with mercy. His power is simple to describe and difficult to truly imagine in calm detail. With a single punch, he can melt ice fields that stretch across a bay, punch through armored ships as if they were paper lanterns, and, most chillingly, erase half of a man's body in one brutal, decisive instant. At Marineford, his magma fists did not merely wound, they rewrote the battlefield, turning white ice to steaming pits and clear air to drifting ash, and the deeper truth of their nature is that they leave marks that the world cannot easily forget. You see it in Whitebeard's chest, once a symbol of unbroken dominance, now permanently scarred by a molten fist that tore away flesh and pride in equal measure. You see it in the hole through Ace, a wound so absolute that even the strongest will could not close it. Those strikes did more than end lives and shake fleets. They defined the emotional landscape of that war, a quiet line between the age that was and the age that followed. And the question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. For most figures who walk this sea, contact with Akainu's magma is a one-way journey into absence. Their bodies, no matter how well trained or spiritually fortified, are simply not built to endure that level of heat and crushing force. Bones char, organs cook, hockey-coated defenses buckle, and even legends like Jinbei and Ivankov treat his approach not as a challenge to relish, but as a disaster to be delayed, redirected, or escaped, if at all possible. Yet, when you set that image beside Kaido, the contrast becomes quietly unsettling. This is a creature who has bathed in dragonfire, endured lightning that splits the sky, and taken internal explosions and external slashes that would reduce most commanders to drifting smoke, only to shake his head, complain of a mild sting, and keep drinking. Tonight we walk slowly through these extremes because Kaido's monstrous physique and mythical Zoan form do not treat elemental assaults as death sentences, but as conditions of the weather. Painful, yes, but rarely decisive. Before you drift into sleep, you can let your mind rest on a single, lingering image. Magma crashing against azure dragon scales high above a ruined battlefield. How much of Kaido's body would truly yield to that burning authority, and how much would simply smolder, crack, and keep moving forward? And what happens to the balance of this world if the day ever comes when we see that question answered directly on the page? Rank 13. Kizaru, Lightspeed Impact against an unmoving wall. If magma was one kind of answer to Kaido's impossible body, then light is another, colder question entirely, because somewhere else in this vast world there walks an admiral who fights not with weight and heat, but with the effortless, merciless speed of illumination itself. There exists a hierarchy of strength that measures not only how hard someone can strike, but how little time you are given to understand that you have already been struck. Kizaru, with his languid posture and almost bored tone, drifts through battles as if they are mild inconveniences, yet the deeper truth of their nature is that his body can become light, and when he chooses to move, the quiet space between one heartbeat and the next is all he needs. A single raised leg, a casual remark, and then the kick arrives with the speed and force of a laser beam, a column of focused radiance that does not so much travel across the battlefield as redraw it in an instant. In that calm, almost detached style, his power reveals something frightening about this story's physics, because traditional defenses, armor, distance, even reflexes honed by decades of combat, begin to lose meaning when the attack is already there before your mind has finished deciding how to respond. His light-speed blows do not politely announce themselves. They bypass preparation, they strike before most opponents can brace, and the damage they leave behind feels less like a punch and more like the world itself, briefly forgetting that your body should remain in one piece. Characters who survive direct hits from Kizaru are therefore marked by implication, even when the narration stays quiet about it. You understand, watching them rise again, that something in their construction is unusual, whether it is Conqueror's haki layered like invisible armor, some strange and carefully preserved biology, or the simple narrative authority of a figure who must endure to carry the plot forward. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but each time his beam-like kicks fail to end a life, it quietly promotes the target into a different category of being. Tonight, we walk slowly through these categories to arrive back at Kaido, and you can imagine, if only as a thought experiment before you drift into sleep, what it would mean for that languid admiral to plant his heel against an unmoving azure dragon. Kaido's massive frame, heavier than ships, denser than stone, would stand there like a mountain weathering storms, allowing the kinetic energy to crash, to flare, to carve scars into scales that have already known fire, blades, and thunder. We have not yet seen this specific collision of philosophies, light-speed precision against bestial endurance, but Kaido's record against other top-tier assaults suggests a quiet, unsettling possibility that even light itself might struggle to do more than chip away at him over time. And somewhere beyond this hypothetical, another force waits, not defined by elements or particles, but by an older, more mythic authority, which we will drift toward next. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight and subscribe for more calm One Piece stories. Before you drift deeper, a quiet check-in and gentle reminder. A quiet, unsettling possibility that even light itself might struggle to do more than chip away at him over time. And as that thought settles, the pace of the world outside your room has likely faded a little further, the sounds grown softer, the edges of things less sharp, while your own breathing has perhaps become slower and heavier, keeping time with this calm procession of power. Tonight, we walk slowly through a ladder of strength that stretches from familiar pirates and admirals into figures wrapped in ancient authority, yet somewhere along that path, the mind begins to loosen its grip, and the names that felt precise a few minutes ago may now be blurring at the edges. That is not a problem to be solved. It is part of the design. In this quiet corner of the story, there exists a hierarchy of strength, but it is not a test you are meant to pass, only a rhythm you are invited to drift along with. Before you drift into sleep completely, there is a gentle invitation waiting at the edge of your awareness. If you find comfort in these long, measured tours through the world's strongest figures, you are welcome at any point to subscribe for more calm One Piece stories, so that the next time you wish to wander through this sea of legends, the route will already be marked out for you. There is no urgency. The button will still be there in the morning. In earlier moments, we spoke softly about distance, about scattered listeners in different rooms and different countries, each with their own small patch of darkness and their own screen's quiet glow. That invitation remains the same now. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, not as a demand for attention, but as a way of drawing a faint line between islands on a map that only exists in memory. And if your eyes are already heavy, that thought alone is more than enough. It is entirely acceptable if, by this point, you are only catching fragments of the story, a title here, an image there, the echo of a battle, or the outline of a mythic form. The purpose is not to memorize placements or debate exact rankings, but to let the steady cadence of strength and the deeper truth of their nature carry you slowly and calmly toward rest, the way waves erase footprints on a shore without needing permission. As we rise again through this list, leaving admirals of light and justice behind, each new name we pass causes Kaido's own title to feel both stranger and more appropriate at the same time. For in a world of gods, dragons, and hidden sovereigns, why should one pirate be called the strongest creature at all? The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, and so, as we move forward, we turn our attention back to the weight of his body and to what it truly means to endure. Rank 12. Shanks, the one-armed emperor and the weight of presence. And yet, endurance in this world does not belong to Kaido alone. In the quiet space just beside his legend stands another emperor, one who does not tower as a dragon over cities, but who can still the air of an entire battlefield with the smallest shift of his gaze. Shanks, the one-armed emperor, carries a different kind of gravity, a weight of presence that does not need thunder or scales to be felt. For most of the story's long history, Shanks appears exactly as he wishes to be seen, a calm, smiling figure who laughs with his crew, drinks quietly in coastal bars, and seems almost lighthearted in a world defined by war and ancient authority. But there exists a hierarchy of strength that is never written on any map, never declared in any treaty, and never openly acknowledged by those who tremble beneath it. And within that hidden order, Shanks is not gentle at all. When he walks onto Whitebeard's ship, the wood cracks beneath the pressure of his conqueror's haki. The sky itself seems to tighten, and even a titan like Whitebeard feels compelled to meet him seriously. His spiritual power is not theatrical, yet its effects are unmistakable. Giants fall to their knees, weaker pirates collapse, and the sea grows strangely quiet when his will is allowed to spread without restraint. At Marineford, the war does not end because cannons run out of ammunition or because bodies can no longer rise, but because Shanks simply arrives and says that it will end. And admirals who moments before were ready to die for their justice suddenly pause, measure the cost, and choose not to test the depth of his resolve. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the world's reaction tells you almost everything you need to know. What makes this more striking is how little we have seen of his physical output. One arm, no mythical Zoan, no catalog of on-screen battles stretched over dozens of chapters, and yet warlords hesitate, emperors treat him as an equal, and the Gorosei speak his name with the wary respect reserved for forces that can tilt the world. Shanks represents a kind of invisible durability, not in the sense of skin that blades cannot pierce, but in the sense of a spirit that can stand in front of the strongest and calmly project something even heavier back toward them. If Kaido is a storm that refuses to disperse, Shanks is the still point around which storms curve away at the last moment. Before you drift into sleep, you might think of it this way. Shanks is the pinnacle of will and timing, a swordsman whose every step is chosen, whose every unsheathed blade signals a boundary the world should not cross, while Kaido is the pinnacle of raw, continuous presence, a body that simply refuses to leave the stage no matter how many times the world tries to remove it. Tonight, we walk slowly through these contrasts because in that space between visible flesh and invisible pressure lies the deeper truth of their nature. And as we move closer to the top of this ranking, the line between body and will is going to blur in ways that are not entirely comfortable to look at. Some of the figures ahead will test that line so severely that even Kaido's title will begin to feel uncertain. Rank 11. Blackbeard, the abyss that devours pain and power, and it is at this point when Kaido's title itself begins to feel less absolute, that the sea offers a different kind of nightmare, a figure whose body does not simply endure the world's attacks, but seems to swallow them. Tonight we walk slowly through the shadow cast by Marshall D. Teach, known to this quiet world as Blackbeard, a man whose very existence bends the rules that hold almost every other life in one piece in place. For most of the story, he appears as a chaotic, laughing presence, his movements ungainly, his teeth uneven, his gestures loud in a way that feels almost clumsy. Yet behind that exterior, there exists a hierarchy of strength that does not match his outward form at all. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, because Blackbeard's body alone breaks a law that has defined devil fruits since their introduction. One fruit per person, one curse per soul, and death for those who try to take more. He stands as the lone exception, quietly housing the darkness of Yami Yami no Mi and the catastrophic quakes of Gura Gura no Mi in a single, strangely suited frame. The nature of that darkness is not gentle. With the Yami Yami no Mi, Blackbeard becomes a moving gravity well, a human black hole that draws in light, matter, and, most painfully, attacks, pulling them directly into his body instead of letting them pass through or disperse. Unlike the Logias who turn to fire or light and let blows slide away, his darkness forces him to feel every strike more sharply, multiplying the pain, turning each wound into something deeper and more vivid, so that his durability is not the quiet stone of Kaido's flesh, but a paradoxical blend of vulnerability and inevitability. Then, layered over this abyss, lies Whitebeard's former authority, the Gura Gura no Mi, a fruit so destructive that Sengoku once called it capable of ending the world. Through this second power, Blackbeard can shatter air, sea, and stone, sending deep fractures across entire battlefields. Yet when the counterblows land, his reactions remain almost painfully human, screaming, staggering, rolling, his body folding around pain instead of ignoring it. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth noticing that his path to monstrosity does not erase his humanity. It amplifies it, makes every impact louder, every injury more visible. Set beside this, Kaido begins to look like the opposite answer to the same question. Where Blackbeard's void drinks in agony, Kaido's body seems to mute it, to turn lethal scenarios into something that borders on dark comedy, as if the world itself cannot quite find a way to kill him. If Blackbeard is an abyss that devours power, Kaido is a fortress that repels it. Two very different interpretations of what it means to be a monster in human shape, and as we move higher, the figures ahead will test which vision of monstrosity truly rules this ancient sea. Subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories, and if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight. Rank 10. Big Mom, the iron balloon beside the dragon. And yet, in this quiet ranking of monsters, Kaido is not the only fortress the world has produced. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth pausing beside the figure who once ruled Tato Land, a woman spoken of not as a pirate, but as a natural disaster that walks on two legs, whose very hunger could erase a city from the map as easily as a storm tide erases footprints in the sand. Big Mom's public image is loud, chaotic, even grotesque, yet the deeper truth of their nature, hers and Kaido's together, is written first in flesh. Her skin has been called an iron balloon, a surface so unnaturally dense that cannon fire blooms against it like harmless fireworks. Blades skid away with a shriek of metal on something harder than steel, and gunshots disappear into her dress with no more effect than raindrops on a cliff. We have watched entire fleets fire in panic, only to realize that nothing meaningful has pierced her at all. On the rare occasions when blood does appear, it comes with very specific conditions, and the story lingers on them. A blow from a Yonko-level force like Kaido himself, a carefully prepared internal attack that bypasses the surface, or the sudden collapse of her composure when a photograph is broken and an old trauma is exposed. These are not ordinary openings, they are narrow cracks in a wall that otherwise feels absolute. For many years of the narrative, there exists a hierarchy of strength in which Big Mom quietly sat as the upper limit of what a human body could endure, a living standard against which all other durability was measured. In that older understanding, if bullets could not harm her and swords could not cut her, then the question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. But it did not need to be. She simply was. Then, Kaido's record is laid beside hers and the scale has to be adjusted. Where Big Mom shrugs off pirate crews and assassination attempts, Kaido survives formal executions, not once, but dozens of times, with blades snapping against his neck, spears bending, and noose after noose failing to close the account of his life. He does not merely endure battle, he treats death itself as a kind of bored experiment, stepping off sky islands and letting gravity do its quiet work, leaving craters in the earth while his body, irritated more than injured, rises again. If Big Mom is a fortress that no ordinary army can breach, Kaido is a fortress that has been tested by the world's executioners, by governments, by rival emperors, and found, again and again, to be beyond their tools. Tonight, we walk slowly through these distinctions because they explain why, even among Yonko, Only one is called the strongest creature, and as we move higher, the figures ahead will challenge whether even this dragon stands alone at the summit of endurance and authority. Rank 9. Whitebeard, the strongest man, and the wounds that finally landed. And among those figures, there is perhaps no clearer mirror for Kaido's title than the man who once stood above all others as the strongest man in the world. In the quiet chaos of Marineford, with cannon fire blooming like brief, violent stars and magma turning the air itself into a weapon, Whitebeard walked forward as if the sea of war were shallow water, his vast frame absorbing bullets, blades, and explosions that would have ended lesser legends in a single heartbeat. There exists a hierarchy of strength that is not written in bounties or official ranks, and at the summit of the age before Wano, it was Whitebeard who occupied that space, his body treated by the world as a fortress that could be shelled without end yet would not fall. He took Akainu's magma fist clean through his chest, he endured Kizaru's light, he suffered blade after blade from nameless soldiers and treacherous commanders, and even as half his face was carved away, the old Titan still split the sky with his quake fruit and commanded the tides of that war. When the battle finally ended for him, it did so with a kind of quiet dignity that felt almost ancient. Whitebeard died standing, his back unmarked by any wound of retreat, his chest and front carved, pierced, and burned, a living record of every step he had chosen to take forward. The narrator told us his body bore hundreds of sword wounds, bullets, and cannon shots, yet not a single scar on his back, and in that simple detail, the story folded physical durability into symbolic endurance, the truth of a man who refused to turn away. His durability was never just muscle and bone. It was the stubborn continuation of an era that would not kneel until overwhelmed by time, by betrayal from within his own ranks, and by the concentrated authority of the Marines and warlords gathered in one place. Before you drift into sleep, you might picture him as a wall built across the ocean's history, one that could only be toppled when the entire world leaned its weight against it. He fell, but he chose how he fell. Now, place that image beside Kaido, a creature whose body has met the world not only on the battlefield, but on the execution platform. Where Whitebeard's end was a single, final stand, Kaido's relationship with death has been a long, almost weary conversation, captured by Marines and rival forces, chained and tortured, presented again and again to blades and ropes and spears that should have finished him, yet never did. The rope snaps, the spear bends, the executioner's weapon shatters against his neck as if striking the hull of some ancient warship. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether it lies only in his mythical zone or in something deeper in his nature. What does it mean that the world could, in the end, kill the strongest man, yet has repeatedly failed to even successfully execute the strongest creature? And if Whitebeard's last stand marked the sunset of one age, what kind of night must be crossed before something, or someone, can finally bring this dragon down for good? Rank 8. Garp and Sengoku, human legends against inhuman flesh. If Whitebeard's final stand was the last blaze of a dying sun, then the figures who once stood opposite Rocks Dizabek were like distant, steady stars, burning with a quieter, relentless heat that defined an age. Among them, two human names sit near the very top of the world's memory of marine power: Monkey D. Garp and Sengoku the Buddha, living legends whose fists and shockwaves became the blunt instruments of what the government liked to call justice. Tonight, we walk slowly through their presence as a kind of measuring stick, because there exists a hierarchy of strength that is not written in any formal document, yet every pirate and every marine learns it in their bones. Garp, the man who could trade blows with the Pirate King, whose galaxy impact would later crater a battlefield in his old age, and Sengoku, whose golden Buddha form could unleash calm, devastating waves of force that folded pirate crews like paper, were not administrators who happened to be strong, but warriors whose bodies had been carved into weapons by decades of battle. If anyone in that older era could stand in front of monsters like Rocks and Roger and not simply be erased, it was these two, their knuckles and their haki hardened against the most violent storms the sea could offer. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether Garp's strength is purely human will and training, or whether there is something deeper in his nature. But what matters for Kaido is that he grew up in the long shadow of men like this. As a junior member of the Rocks Pirates, he was not yet the Emperor of Onigashima, but a raw, brutal creature moving within the orbit of their power, a young beast watched, measured, and inevitably targeted by the era's strongest humans. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth pausing on what that actually means. The same institutions that once coordinated with Garp to bring down Rocks, the same Marines who watched Sengoku clash with Whitebeard at Marineford, would eventually lay their hands on Kaido again and again, capturing him, chaining him, arranging public executions with all the cold authority of the state. And yet every rope, every spear, every guillotine failed, not because mercy stayed their hand, but because metal bent, blades snapped, and his neck refused to yield. This is the pattern interrupt in his story, an inhuman result produced in the most controlled, human environment imaginable. Execution platforms are designed to end legends, to turn terrifying names into quiet history, and the deeper truth of their nature is that they are supposed to work regardless of how much you struggle. Kaido turned them into experiments, and each failure became another data point proving that his durability was not a rumor whispered in the New World, but a fact tested and confirmed by the very system built to break pirates. When you place his body next to the fists of Garp and the golden shockwaves of Sengoku, and realize that even the world's greatest human enforcers, backed by prisons, weapons, and procedure, could not permanently cage this former apprentice of Rocks, you begin to understand why later sections of this list will have to move beyond humans altogether, into dragons, gods, and the ancient authorities that stand above even marine legends. Rank 7, Yamato, the heir who inherited a fraction of the beast. And when you step very quietly from those human legends into the shadow of Kaido's lineage, the air itself seems to grow heavier, as if the world is reminding you that there exists a hierarchy of strength that does not stop at admirals, heroes, or even kings. It extends into bloodlines, into creatures who blur the line between person and calamity, and at rank 7, that truth takes the shape of Kaido's own child, Yamato. Yamato stands as a powerful, determined figure, a solitary guardian pacing the halls of Onigashima with shackles on their wrists and an ancient will in their chest, carrying both Kaido's blood and the mythical power of the Okuchi no Makami, a guardian wolf deity once worshipped by Wano. The form they take is not merely a beast, but a symbol, a quiet echo of Wano's forgotten gods fused with the raw, unyielding biology of the so-called strongest creature, and the deeper truth of their nature is that even this hybrid miracle is only a fraction of what their father represents. You see it most clearly on the rooftop, under the cold sky above the drifting island, where Yamato does something that, in this story, very few figures can claim. They clash with Kaido directly, trading blows with the dragon who once shrugged off Gear 4 as if it were a passing breeze. Club meets club, thunder meets thunder, and Yamato withstands hits that would flatten most commanders, their bodies skidding across stone, bones screaming, yet their stance resetting again and again into that quiet, stubborn defiance. Before you drift into sleep, you might picture how long that fight actually lasts, how Yamato holds Kaido off alone to protect Luffy's chance, how they take named techniques, searing breath, and brutal swings that shatter the rooftop and still keep moving. Their durability and stamina sit in that rare, Yonko-adjacent space where each strike absorbed feels like something that should end a battle, yet only marks the midpoint instead, suggesting that Kaido's lineage by itself produces bodies that are difficult to break, difficult to exhaust, difficult even to imagine living ordinary lives. And yet, when you place Yamato's effort against the full canvas of that night, the scale difference quietly reveals itself. Kaido does not only fight Yamato, he endures the scabbards and their inherited rage, the supernovas and their experimental tactics, multiple rounds against Luffy including the awakening of Gear 5, all while holding up an entire island with his flame clouds, casually maintaining an act of continuous, world-shaping power in the background. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the contrast is already enough to feel. In this way, Yamato becomes a kind of measuring tool, a scaled-down, more human-readable version of Kaido's body, a reminder that what we see in the child is the same resilience and divine beastly authority, simply not yet magnified to its final, almost absurd degree. Tonight we walk slowly through that implication, because if a guardian wolf empowered by Kaido's blood only reaches the edges of Yonko territory, then, to understand the father himself, we will have to leave the human frame of reference almost entirely behind in the next section. Subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories, and if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight as we turn from the heir to the beast who made even execution itself seem like a meaningless ritual. Rank 6. The Ancient Giants and Oars. When size alone is not enough. And so, as the echoes of the sun's ambition fade into the quiet of the Wano night, the story invites you to look at a different kind of enormity, one that has existed in the world since long before Kaido ever raised his banner. Tonight, we walk slowly through the shadows of beings so large that even warships become toys in their hands, and fortified cities feel like scattered stones beneath their feet. Among these are the ancient giants and the monstrous figure known as oars, whose very footsteps rewrote the shape of battlefields, turning open plains into narrow corridors and castle walls into little more than knee-high obstacles. There exists a hierarchy of strength that most humans can barely perceive, and at this scale, power begins with mass itself, with bones like pillars, with muscles layered thickly enough that cannon fire feels distant and muffled, as though heard from underwater. Their size grants a kind of natural armor, thicker skulls that can take blunt force without shattering, longer limbs that keep enemies at a distance, chests broad enough that even a deep wound might not reach anything vital. Yet, the deeper truth of their nature is that this enormity is also a quiet liability. The larger the target, the easier it becomes to trace a trajectory, to plan a bombardment, to focus dozens of small, precise attacks into the same weakened point again and again. You can see this clearly in the story of Oars at Marineford's frozen stage, a resurrected colossus whose charge shook the ice itself, whose swings of the arm could erase entire formations in a single, thoughtless motion. For a time, he seemed like an advancing natural disaster, a walking landslide of flesh and ancient muscle, but the longer the battle went on, the more visible the pattern became, as coordinated effort, careful timing, and the quiet accumulation of burns, cuts, and punctures slowly unraveled the integrity of that gigantic frame. Oars did not fall because one blow equaled his mass. He fell because many smaller figures, working together, found the seams in his durability and patiently widened them. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth noticing how different this is from the way Kaido endures. His dragon form, coiling above Onigashima like a living storm front, shares the same overwhelming presence, the same battlefield warping scale. Yet even when he returns to his comparatively human frame, the hardness of his body does not meaningfully diminish. Where Oars could eventually be worn down by strategy and repetition, Kaido in his base form simply absorbs punishment that would cripple giants, treating deep cuts as surface scratches and blunt force trauma as an irritation rather than a threat. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether it lies in his ancient lineage, in the mythical Zoan that wraps itself around his biology, or in some denser, stranger core that the narrative has only hinted at. What is clear is that his title as the strongest creature cannot be reduced to being big. It is something more concentrated, more absolute, and in the next section we will move from comparisons of size to the failed executions and quiet failed suicides that reveal what happens when the world itself tries to break Kaido and simply cannot. Rank 5. The Admirals. Together, a storm of elements against one body. When the world government wishes to remind the seas where official authority resides, it does not send banners or speeches, it sends admirals, and each one arrives wrapped in an element that does not care about human limits. Magma, that can turn an island into a scar. light that moves too quickly for most eyes to follow, gravity that bends the horizon and pulls the sky down toward the earth. These are not simply techniques, they are environmental forces given human shape. There exists a hierarchy of strength that places these figures near the very top of what the system can field openly, and when they move together, the quiet balance of the world tilts. One admiral marching alone is already a calamity, able to rewrite coastlines, erase fleets, and leave behind a story that entire generations will repeat in lowered voices. But when 2 or 3 of them act in concert, their combined output becomes something else entirely, a concentrated knot of destructive power that few can even imagine standing against directly. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the results are clear enough. Tonight we walk slowly through an imagined scene, because sometimes a hypothetical reveals the deeper truth of their nature more clearly than any official report. Picture a battlefield with no civilians, no politics, only a single target and an order with no uncertainty. Eliminate. Akainu's magma fists rise and fall like volcanic artillery. Kizaru's light-speed kicks carve through the air in clean, merciless lines. Fujitora's gravity presses down until stone screams and steel bends, and perhaps Green Bull's life-draining roots creep outward, turning the very ground into a weapon. Nothing subtle, nothing restrained. In such a storm, most legends would not be shamed for choosing to evade rather than endure. Even emperors, even old lions like Whitebeard in his prime, or Big Mom at full hunger, might be forced to give ground, not because their wills are weak, but because the elements themselves would be stacking, layering, and compounding in a way that leaves almost no safe angle to occupy. Very few individuals in this long, ancient story feel as though they could simply plant their feet, raise their guard, and allow that entire orchestra of destruction to crash against their body without immediately seeking escape. And yet, when you think of Kaido, the mind hesitates. Before you drift into sleep, you might find yourself quietly picturing magma splashing against dragon scales that do not quite melt, light-speed blows thudding into an unyielding torso that refuses to fold, gravity pushing down on a creature that has already tried to end himself from heights far greater and found the ground wanting. Whether he would win such a confrontation is another matter, but the idea that his body alone might endure that first terrible volley and still be standing in the smoke, breathing slowly, is part of why he is not merely called the strongest pirate, but the strongest creature. In the next section, we will leave this imagined battlefield and return to documented attempts, to execution platforms, ropes, spears, and blades that met his neck and failed, and to the quiet moments when Kaido himself tried to do what even admirals might not be able to finish. Rank 4. Rocks D. Sebek, the ghost of a monster. Before monsters. And as those ropes snap and those blades fail, another shadow quietly lengthens behind Kaido, a reminder that even monsters are sometimes standing on someone else's shoulders. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth turning your attention back in time to a ship that no longer sails and to a captain whose name still moves the world in a way that feels almost like an echo from an ancient storm. This is Rocks D. Zebek, a figure so wrapped in mystery that, in many ways, he feels less like a man and more like a rumor the sea itself once believed in. Tonight, we walk slowly through the outline of his legend, a pirate who did not merely command a crew, but gathered under one banner young and unpolished monsters who would later become the pillars of a new era. Names like Whitebeard, Big Mom, Shiki, and, somewhere in the background, a brutally ambitious Kaido. There exists a hierarchy of strength that is never written on any map, never declared in any formal treaty, and never openly acknowledged by those who benefit from keeping it hidden. And in the age before Roger, Rocks sat near the very top of that invisible structure. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. We do not know what devil fruit he possessed, if any, nor the exact form of his haki, nor the limits of his body, yet the reaction to his name tells its own quiet truth. It took both Goldie Roger and Monkey D. Garp fighting side by side at God Valley to finally bring him down. And even then, the world government did not simply record a victory, they tried to erase the entire event from history itself. You can feel, in that attempt to wipe him away, how deeply his power unsettled those who sit in distant rooms of authority. For Kaido, this was not distant history, it was his workplace, his sky, the air he breathed as a young warrior. Imagine growing up in the shadow of a captain whose presence could make future emperors feel like subordinates, whose ambition was so large it aimed not at treasure or territory but at seizing the world itself from the celestial dragons. If Kaido later spoke of wanting to start the greatest war the world had ever seen, that vocabulary of overwhelming force did not come from nowhere. It was, in part, the language of rocks spoken again in a deeper, more physical register. So when you look at Kaido's body, at the neck that executions could not sever and the skin that cannons could not meaningfully mark, you are also looking at a survivor of that earlier crucible, a creature tempered on a ship where weakness was not simply mocked, but discarded. The deeper truth of their nature is that philosophy can leave scars just as real as blades, and Rock's creed of refusing to bow, refusing to die, seems to have settled into Kaido's bones. In that sense, Rocks is a ghostly benchmark. If he was the half-seen monster of the previous age, then Kaido is the refined, brutally explicit embodiment of that same idea in the current one, a living reminder that some storms do not end, they simply change vessels. In the next section, we will follow that lineage of inhuman strength even further back, to beings who were never merely pirates or kings, but walking weapons from forgotten centuries, and to the quiet question of what kind of world could have produced creatures like them in the first place. Rank 3. Monkey D. Dragon and the Untested Storm. And yet, even as those ancient echoes fade, the world has quietly produced a different kind of storm, one that does not roar from a throne or announce itself with a drunken laugh, but gathers on distant horizons and rearranges the map in silence. That storm has a name that even the world government speaks with care. Monkey D. Dragon, the world's most wanted man, the leader of the Revolutionary Army, a figure whose very appearances in the story seem to drag wind, rain, and shifting skies in his wake. Tonight we walk slowly through a different interpretation of strength, one that does not yet have the clear, brutal numbers that Kaido's body can boast, but instead is measured in wanted posters, toppled kingdoms, and the quiet terror of those who sit in Mariajoa and watch their authority erode. Dragon's power has never been shown in a full, extended battle. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, and yet the scale of his chosen enemy speaks for him, because to raise your flag directly against the world government itself is to declare that you believe you can, in time, break the most entrenched system in existence. For most of the story's long history, Dragon appears only at the edges, a cloak, a shadow, a gust of wind that changes everything and then is gone again. And in that restraint, there is a different kind of durability. He survives not by standing in the center of the battlefield and demanding that the world come to him, but by enduring in the margins, by building an army under constant surveillance, by moving through a world of spies, bounties, and quiet assassinations that should have erased him long ago. This is a body tested not by guillotines and execution platforms, but by years of political pressure, failed uprisings, and the weight of an idea that the rulers of the world are desperate to crush. Kaido, by contrast, embodies the opposite philosophy. There exists a hierarchy of strength that is never written on paper, and Kaido chose to sit openly near the top of it, declaring himself an emperor, inviting every challenger, every marine fleet, every ambitious pirate to try their luck against a body that had already shrugged off chains, blades, and the long drop from the sky. Dragon hides his hand. Kaido slams his fist on the table and dares the world to move it. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth remembering that one of these men has been thoroughly, almost obsessively tested, while the other remains largely theoretical, a storm we have only seen from a distance, until the day Dragon is forced into the open and the wind around him finally takes a clear shape. Kaido remains the clearest, most documented example of a creature the world has tried and failed to erase, and the deeper truth of their nature may only be revealed when those two philosophies of survival finally collide on the same battlefield. Subscribe for more calm One Piece stories, and in the next section, we will leave the realm of hidden revolutionaries and declared emperors altogether and walk toward beings whose very existence suggests that the world once produced monsters far beyond either, raising the quiet question of whether even Kaido's body is only a faint reflection of what once roamed the seas. Rank 2, Goldie, Roger, the king whose body reached its natural limit. And so, from dragons of rumor and governments of shadow, the list arrives at a man who needed no mythic title beyond 3 quiet words: Pirate King, Roger. Tonight we walk slowly through a different kind of strength, one that did not come from an unkillable hide or an ancient fruit, but from a human body driven as far as nature would allow it to go, and then, a little further, by will alone. Goldie Roger stands in the story as a completed sentence. He found Laugh-Tale, he challenged the world's authority simply by existing. He carved his name so deeply into history that every pirate who lifts a sail afterward is, in some way, answering to him. His body endured the Grand Line, the New World, countless battles, and the quiet strain of carrying a crew that included monsters like Rayleigh, Oden, and Gabon, until, at last, an incurable illness began to eat away at the foundation of that power. For most of his final voyage, Roger is already dying, and that is one of the deeper truth of their nature moments that the story offers about legends. They are not immune to time, they simply walk ahead of it for a while. He fights Whitebeard while sick, he laughs with Oden while sick, he reaches the final island while sick, and then, calmly, he steps back. The Pirate King disbands his crew, says his goodbyes, and walks toward the end that his own body is quietly demanding. It is here that his strength takes on a different shape. Rather than vanish in obscurity, Roger turns himself into the world government, allowing his body to be paraded, chained, and finally executed at Logtown, the town of beginnings and ends. The blades that strike him do not bounce. The platform does not crack under some impossible resistance. Instead, steel passes through flesh, and the man whose will shook the seas lets nature and human judgment finish their work. His last words ignite the great pirate era, but his body, dignified and finite, falls. In Roger, there exists a hierarchy of strength that feels almost comforting. Youth, prime, decline, and death all in order. Disease and time wear him down, and the executioner's weapons complete what illness began. It is a life fully spent, a flame that burns to its base, leaving only embers of legacy and a world rearranged around his absence. Kaido is something else. Where Roger's body yields, Kaido's refuses. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but we know that hanging, spears, and blades all fail to claim him, and that even when he throws himself from Sky Islands, the earth breaks while his form survives. Before you drift into sleep, hold these two silhouettes side by side. Roger, the human king who walked to his natural end, and Kaido, the strongest creature whose very existence suggests a body that rejects the quiet script of decline and death, hinting that what waits above him on this list may be stranger still. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight as we move next to those whose power bends not just their own bodies, but the shape of the world itself. Rank 1. Luffy, the sun, god who finally reached the beast. It is only when you reach the very top of this quiet ladder of monsters that you notice something almost gentle in the way the story crowns its next challenger, because standing opposite Kaido's ancient, unyielding body is not another titan of stone and steel, but a laughing rubber man whose nature is to bend, to stretch, and to refuse every rigid rule the world tries to place on him. Tonight, we walk slowly through the figure who finally pushed the strongest creature to the edge of his limits, Monkey D. Luffy. From the beginning, Luffy's body has been an oddity, a simple-seeming parlor trick of rubber in the calm waters of East Blue, where cannonballs bounced and punches elongated, more playful than divine, more comedic than catastrophic. Yet there exists a hierarchy of strength that the story has been sketching from those early days, and as Luffy moved from East Blue into Paradise and then into the deep storms of the New World, each island, each enemy, and each near-death encounter quietly carved another layer into his body, teaching it how to take more, how to give more, how to stand longer against the pressure that was always waiting at the summit in Wano. By the time he reached the rooftop of Onigashima, this same rubber body had crossed an invisible threshold, no longer merely a clever fruit, but the awakened form of the Hito Hito, Nomi, model, Nika, turning Luffy into something the world had not seen for centuries. Gear 5 is not just another stage in a numbered sequence, it is a fundamental shift in how his flesh and bones interact with reality itself. A state where his heartbeat drums like a festival, where the ground can become rubber, where lightning can be grasped and swung, where his imagination begins to dictate the physics around him, and where his very presence becomes an embodiment of freedom, elasticity, and joy. And yet, even with this godlike form, the path to bringing Kaido down was not clean, nor quick, nor simple. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth remembering how many times Luffy fell unconscious beneath that kanabo, how many times his heart stopped, how many times his allies had to buy him seconds with their own blood, and how long Kaido had already been fighting. The scabbards, the supernovas, Yamato, waves of enemies that would each be final bosses in another story, all wearing away at the dragon who still refused to break. When Gear 5 finally arrived, it looked, on the surface, like pure comedy, like a cartoon scribbled over a battlefield, yet the deeper truth of their nature was harsher and more reverent than that, because every elastic punch that folded Kaido's face, every giant fist that drove him down through the clouds, every moment where reality itself bent into a white, bouncing canvas was still being thrown against a body that had once laughed at execution, that had turned suicide into a hobby, that had survived everything the world could do to it, and continued drinking. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the result is clear. Even with the sun god awakened, even with the full weight of Wano and the sky itself behind him, Luffy only barely managed to drive Kaido into the earth below, sealing him in magma after a battle that stretched through the night. What this quietly confirms is that, at this moment in the narrative, Luffy, at his radiant peak, stands as the one figure who could finally reach the beast, while Kaido's fallen form still marks the upper boundary of what a living body in this world has endured. As we move higher into forces that are less about flesh and more about ancient authority, subscribe for more calm One Piece stories if you wish, because the powers above Kaido and Luffy may reshape not just bodies, but the very age they inhabit. The strongest creature, not the strongest man. What Kaido's title really means. And yet, even as we leave Kaido and Luffy buried beneath the rubble of a fallen capital, there is a quiet detail the world never lets go of, a single phrase that lingers in reports and whispered conversations alike. Kaido is not remembered first as an emperor, or as a pirate captain, or even as a warrior who ruled the skies above Wano. He is remembered as the strongest creature. In a world that loves titles, where there exists a hierarchy of strength expressed through names like Pirate King, Strongest Man, Fleet Admiral, and Greatest Swordsman, this particular wording stands apart, never quite fitting in with the others, never quite allowing him to be treated as just another man who rose through ambition. Whitebeard's epithet, the strongest man in the world, still anchors him to human limits and human categories, while Roger's Pirate King remains a crown tied to ships, crews, and the social structure of the seas. Kaido's label quietly steps outside all of that. Tonight, we walk slowly through what that implies. To call him the strongest creature is to admit, almost reluctantly, that his body is perceived less as a person's frame and more as a calamity given muscles and scales, something closer to a stormfront or an ancient beast than a citizen of any nation. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the language people choose around him reveals the deeper truth of their nature. They do not speak of defeating Kaido the way they might speak of outwitting a pirate or capturing a criminal. They speak of surviving him. Public tales about Whitebeard tend to drift toward his final stand, the way he died on his feet, the holes in his chest, and the age in his bones. Stories about Roger circle around his treasure, his execution, his era of discovery. Stories about Kaido, by contrast, return again and again to failed beheadings and broken execution devices, to the quiet horror of a body that turned death into a routine inconvenience. They mention that he has been captured and tortured, that more than 40 attempts were made to end him, that spears bent, blades shattered, and ropes snapped while his skin refused to yield. Even his so-called hobby of suicide, those calm descents from Sky Islands that end with the earth fractured and his body largely unbothered, reinforces this idea that the world does not treat him as a rational actor so much as a natural disaster testing its own limits. Before you drift into sleep, you might notice how rarely anyone in the story describes Kaido in terms of tactics or politics. Instead, they measure him in craters, in collapsed castles, in the number of top-tier fighters he can endure in a single long night. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because across every sea the pattern is the same. When people speak of Kaido, they reach instinctively for the language we reserve for mythic creatures, for dragons and giants and unkillable things that haunt the edges of old maps. Understanding his body means accepting that, within this quiet fictional world, he occupies a category slightly beyond man, slightly beyond pirate, a living proof that the boundary between human and monster can be crossed in flesh alone. And as we move from this singular creature into forces whose power rests not in muscle but in ancient authority, the next figures on this list will ask a different question altogether. What happens when the strongest creature must bow before something that is barely a creature at all? 40 failed executions, when death itself gives up, and yet, for all that looming authority above him, there is a quieter, more unsettling record written directly onto Kaido's flesh, a record that belongs to no emperor, no admiral, and no elder. Long before he ruled Wano, long before the world settled on calling him the strongest creature, different powers tried to answer a very simple question with very decisive methods. Could this body actually be killed? They did not test him once or twice, but more than 40 times, each attempt a formal, structured execution carried out by Marines, rival crews, and frightened governments who understood exactly what they were dealing with. Executions in this world are not vague, theatrical gestures. They are designed to be clean, final, and brutally efficient, concentrating force on the most vulnerable points of a human frame. The neck placed on a block, the rope tightened around the throat, the spear aimed with care at the heart. Tonight, we walk slowly through those chambers, through those scaffold platforms and torchlit courtyards where Kaido was bound, restrained, and presented to the tools that had ended so many legends before him. What followed, again and again, was not mercy, not rescue, but failure at the level of matter itself. The ropes meant to break his neck simply snapped, fibers giving way before vertebrae did, as if the material understood that the weight it was asked to bear did not belong to a normal living thing. Blades came down with full intent and shattered on his skin, steel losing its integrity on contact, the edge turning to fragments while the supposed victim remained upright. Spears, bent like softened reeds, the metal warping around his body instead of through it, until the executioners were left holding weapons that looked more like question marks than instruments of death. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the results are recorded clearly enough. In the quiet circles of the underworld, where bounty posters are traded like omens and names are weighed against potential profit, Kaido's death attempts slowly shifted from reports to anecdotes, and from anecdotes to a kind of dark shared joke. Here was a figure who actively sought the end, whose hobby was listed as suicide, and yet whose body refused to cooperate with his will, as if the deeper truth of their nature had diverged, mind reaching for oblivion, flesh insisting on survival. Before you drift into sleep, you can almost hear the uncomfortable laughter in those rooms, the way it never quite reaches the eyes. If you let yourself imagine one of those scenes in detail, the sound comes first, the sharp ring of an executioner's blade descending, followed not by the expected dull impact of metal through bone, but by a higher, brittle crack as the weapon itself gives way. Then, there is the silence, the kind that presses on the ears, as guards, officials, and onlookers realize that the man in chains is unmarked and that the world's familiar methods of ending life have simply failed. In that long, suspended moment, there exists a hierarchy of strength that no title can fully capture, and Kaido stands at a point in it that feels almost wrong. Pattern interrupt. Imagine, just for a heartbeat, that one of those attempts had worked, that a single rope had held, a single blade had held its edge. The story that follows would be smaller, quieter, and the balance of power in this world would tilt toward those ancient authorities we are about to visit without ever having to account for the creature they could not kill. Subscribe for more calm. One Piece stories if you feel like it. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, and in the next section, we step away from flesh and bone entirely, into a realm where execution is replaced by erasure, and where death is not resisted by the body, but administered by the map itself. A hobby called suicide, sky islands, craters, and an unbroken frame. Yet even in a world where maps can kill and borders can erase, there exists a hierarchy of strength that is written not on paper, but in flesh that refuses to break, and in bodies that treat death as a suggestion rather than a law. To understand why Kaido is not simply called a strong pirate or a powerful emperor, but the strongest creature, you have to watch him fall, and you have to watch what happens after he hits the ground. The image is almost quiet in its first moments. A sky island hangs high above the world, far beyond the reach of ordinary authority, its edge fading into pale cloud and thin, distant air. From that impossible height, a single figure steps off, not pushed, not thrown, but moving with the calm certainty of someone clocking out of work, and then Kaido is no longer standing. He is plummeting, cutting through the clouds like a falling star that has chosen to abandon the sky. Before you drift into sleep, you can follow that descent in your mind's eye, the way the wind screams around a body that weighs more than ships, the way the distant land rises slowly, then rapidly, then all at once. The ground does not welcome him. When he lands, the earth reacts the way any living thing would when struck by a catastrophe from above. The soil splits, stone fractures, and a crater blooms outward in a rough, jagged circle, dust rising in a vast, choking column that momentarily blots out the horizon. For a long breath, the environment tells you a simple story. The cracked earth, the shattered rock, the broken buildings at the crater's edge all speak of finality, of an impact that should have turned bone to powder and organs to paste, of a fall from such height that even giants or ancient beasts would have been reduced to quiet, broken shapes at the center. For almost any other being in this story, this is where the narrative would end. But Kaido's nature refuses that ending. When the dust begins to settle, when the echoes stop rolling across the landscape, he is there at the center of the wound he has carved into the world, not as a corpse, but as a silhouette pushing itself up, skin-marked but unbroken, voice not silenced but annoyed. Suicide for him becomes less a conclusion and more a hobby, a grim pastime repeated between battles and imprisonments, a ritual he performs in search of a death that will not come. Tonight we walk slowly through these attempts not to glorify them, but to recognize what they quietly prove. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. Whether it is the work of his mythical Zoan, the Uo Uo no Mi, nudging his biology into something draconic and indestructible, or whether the fruit merely crowned a body that was already unnatural. What is clear is that terminal velocity for Kaido is not terminal at all, just another inconvenience brushed aside as he rises yet again, still breathing, still restless, still looking for a force in this deep and dangerous world that can finally make him stay down. In the next section, we leave the open sky and the craters behind and move into the quieter records of torture chambers and execution platforms, where blades, ropes, and spears all discover the same uncomfortable truth about the strongest creature alive. Scars that matter. Oden's slash and the rarity of permanent wounds. And when the blades and ropes fail, when the spears bend and the platforms splinter, the story narrows down to the few moments where something actually does stay with him. Among all the attempts to break Kaido, Kozuki Oden's charge stands apart like a quiet legend etched into living flesh. On that day, as the clouds over Wano parted and the boiling cauldron waited, Oden did not creep toward his fate. He sprinted, twin blades drawn, cutting through the air and the distance between them, with the calm certainty of a man who already knew how his story would end. When Enma and Amy no Habakiri came down, they did not simply cut scales and skin, they carved a deep, X-shaped wound across the dragon's massive torso, a red cross of defiance burning against a body that had treated execution as a joke. Tonight, we walk slowly through that moment because it is not just spectacle, it is measurement. In a world where there exists a hierarchy of strength, Oden's scar becomes a unit of comparison, a rare data point on an otherwise unreadable surface. Kaido has been dropped from the sky, pierced, burned, and battered by cannons and conquerors. Yet, when you look at him, really look at him, this is one of the only clearly visible, permanent injuries the story allows you to see. The rest of his form, in human shape or in the vast sweep of his azure dragon body, is strangely unmarked, as if the world has been striking at a mountain that refuses to remember being hit. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. Some of it lies in the mythical zone that wraps around his already monstrous frame, some of it in the ancient durability that lets him turn suicide attempts into bored pastimes. But the effect is the same. Most attacks, even powerful ones, either fail to penetrate deeply enough or vanish from his surface as if healed by time that moves differently for him. The deeper truth of their nature is that scars, for figures like Kaido, are not a default outcome of battle. They are a negotiated exception. That is why Oden's mark feels less like damage and more like a monument. It is a reminder that while Kaido's body is nearly unbreakable, it is not literally untouchable, that with specific high-level conditions, a will sharpened by decades at sea, blades steeped in advanced haki, a perfectly timed opening, even the strongest creature can be forced to carry a memory he cannot shrug off. Before you drift into sleep, you might notice how easily we can name the few who have done this to him. Oden then, much later, Luffy with his Gear 5 blows that finally echo that first rebellion of flesh. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because in the next section we follow those faint lines of damage forward, and watch how each fresh clash in the sky over Onigashima asks whether that X-shaped wound was the beginning of a pattern, or the last time the world would ever mark him so deeply. The Uo wo no Mi model Seiryu, when a dragon wears a man. Those lines of damage lead us, almost inevitably, to the thing that wraps around Kaido's body like a question the world has not yet answered. The Uo wo no Mi model Seiryu, a mythical Zoan that does not simply turn a man into a beast, but lets a beast wear the shape of a man, and then a dragon, and then something that feels older than both. In the quiet taxonomy of devil fruits, there exists a hierarchy of strength that is rarely spoken aloud, yet it guides how power settles into this world. At the base, you have Paramecia, twisting the rules of matter, Logia, turning bodies into elements, and then Zoan fruits, which, at their core, are about flesh, muscle, and the stubborn refusal of a living form to fall apart. Zoans harden the frame, thicken the blood, deepen stamina and recovery, and mythical Zoans sit at the very peak of that line, not only granting transformation but layering on strange, almost divine abilities that feel borrowed from legend rather than biology. Kaido's fruit is an eastern dragon, Seiryu, a figure tied to storms, rivers, and the quiet, terrifying idea of natural authority. When he lengthens into that vast serpentine form, coils blotting out the sky over Wano, it is not just spectacle, it is the visual expression of what his body already was. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth remembering that Kaido was called a monster long before he ever became a dragon, captured and tortured, executed and displayed, and yet never truly broken. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. What is clear is that the fruit arrived as an amplifier, not a substitute. The deeper truth of their nature for most mythical Zoan users is that the fruit nests inside an already unusual vessel and then magnifies everything that was there. In Kaido's case, the Seiryu form stretches his already inhuman durability across a colossal frame, lets his lungs pull in storms for breath, and allows his heart to keep beating under pressures that should crush lesser creatures into silence. Look at his scales. In dragon form, they are not decorative. They are layered plates of living armor, deflecting blades that would pierce ordinary flesh, turning cannon fire into shallow scratches, and forcing even conquerors' blows to work harder just to reach something vital. His sheer size means that damage, when it does land, disperses across a vast landscape of muscle and bone, so that what would be a killing wound on a human becomes, for him, one more ache in a body that has already fallen from the sky and risen again. Tonight, we walk slowly through this distinction, because it matters. The Uo Uo no Mi did not create the strongest creature. It is more like a magnifying glass held over a lifeform the world already struggled to injure, enlarging every brutal advantage, every quiet recovery, until the silhouette became myth. And in the next section, when we return him to his base form and watch him drink, fall, and stand once more, we will see how much of Kaido's endurance remains when the dragon finally coils back inside the man. Endurance on the rooftop, scabbards, supernovas, and a god of battle. When the dragon coils back inside the man, the battlefield itself seems to hold its breath, because what follows is not a single clash, but a quiet, grinding test of how long one body can endure under the weight of the entire world's hatred. Tonight, we walk slowly through the rooftop of Onigashima, that open-air arena above the clouds where there exists a hierarchy of strength written not in titles, but in how long you can keep standing when everyone else has given you their very best. It begins with ghosts, the 9 scabbards carrying Oden's will and his scar like an ancient brand, rush Kaido in the stormlight, and for a brief, startling moment, the story allows you to see him driven to one knee, then to the ground, by the echo of a man he once respected and killed. Their coordinated assault, the twin sword stance of Kinemon, Denjiro's heavy cuts, the piercing thrust of Kiku's blade, all stack atop the lingering memory of Oden's Togen Totsuka, until Kaido's flesh finally yields enough to draw blood and force him down. Most figures in this world would end there, a focused, all-out ambush by 9 hardened samurai, all striking vital points, would be the climax of a life. For Kaido, it is only the opening act. As the scabbards fall away, broken and exhausted, the stage does not empty, it refills, and the worst generation steps forward in their place, a new wave of ambition, testing the limits of an older monster. Luffy in Gear 4 slams into Kaido with Boundman's heavy, rubberized fury. Zoro draws upon Enma and flirts with the edge of advanced Conqueror's haki. Law carves space itself with his surgical room. Kid hurls twisted metal like an iron tidal wave, and Killer's scythes bite again and again at the dragon's hide. These are not probing blows, they are finishing moves, the techniques young pirates save for the moment that decides whether they live or vanish into the sea's memory. And yet, after thunderclaps, explosions, and the quiet horror of Zoro's near-decapitating Asura, Kaido does not retire. He does not even meaningfully withdraw. He simply continues. The fight stretches onward into a long, dark procession. Yamato stands against him in hybrid form, burning her life to delay him, and then Luffy returns again and again, culminating in the impossible elasticity of Gear 5, a state that bends the nature of the battlefield itself, while overhead, Kaido's flame clouds must never falter, because if they do, an entire island will fall. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth pausing on that detail. Most characters in One Piece struggle to maintain peak output for a single high-end battle, their stamina bleeding away as haki reserves run dry, but Kaido spends hours in continuous, top-tier combat while simultaneously upholding the quiet, crushing duty of keeping Onigashima aloft. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether it is the fruit, his species, or the deeper truth of their nature, yet the result is clear. His body does not simply resist damage, it resists fatigue. By the time he finally falls, what has been tested is not just toughness, but a monstrous baseline of endurance that makes even emperors and admirals feel briefly human beside him. And in the next section, when we compare this rooftop gauntlet to the final stands of other legends, we will see how rarely the world has produced a creature who could suffer so much, for so long, and still be feared every second he remained conscious. Thunder Bagua and one-shot power. Offense, born from an unbreakable core. And yet, for all that endurance, for all those quiet moments where Kaido simply refuses to fall, his legend would feel incomplete if his body were only a wall that could not be breached, rather than a hammer that could not be stopped once it began to swing. There exists a hierarchy of strength in this world, and Kaido does not sit near its summit merely because he survives, but because he decides, in an instant, whether someone else will. Thunder Bagua is the clearest expression of that decision, a technique so abrupt that, to the eye, Kaido does not charge or wind up or roar. He simply vanishes from where he was and reappears already mid-swing, Kanabo in motion, air tearing around the iron studs as if the weapon itself were offended by resistance. In that brief, compressed moment, his entire frame twists, his legs dig into the ground, and all the deep weight of his body, fruit and will is channeled along the arc of the club into a single point on an opponent's skull. You saw it most starkly in Wano, when Gear 4 Luffy, who had just rattled Kaido with a storm of blows that shook the capital, seemed to be mounting a real challenge, only for the scene to collapse into something quiet and almost dismissive. Kaido, irritated but calm, stepped forward, invoked Thunder Bagua, and Luffy's body simply folded, eyes rolling white before he even understood that the exchange had ended. One swing, one strike, and the figure who had terrified Whole Cake Island was left unconscious in the dirt. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, because delivering that kind of one-shot power is not simply a matter of muscle or technique. It demands a vessel that does not tear itself apart under its own violence. A lesser body would shred tendons, crack joints, and splinter bone if it tried to accelerate a Kanabo of that mass to such speed, then halted again against the armor of an emperor's hockey-hardened skull. Kaido's nature solves that quietly, turning what should be self-destructive strain into routine motion. His unbreakable frame allows him to commit without hesitation, to throw his entire weight and momentum into the blow with no thought for recoil, backlash, or the delicate maintenance of ligaments and cartilage that governs ordinary fighters. Before you drift into sleep, you can imagine that every Thunder Bagua is not just an attack from the weapon in his hands, but from his spine, his shoulders, the deep core that has survived, falls from Sky Islands and countless failed executions. In this way, his offense and defense become two sides of the same coin, an ancient creature built both to withstand and to deliver punishment on a scale that defines the very top of One Piece's quiet, violent world. Tonight, we walk slowly through these upper tiers of power, and as we move beyond Kaido's one-shot terror to the subtler, stranger forms of authority that rival even him, you may find that he is not the only figure whose body was shaped for a single, overwhelming purpose, but he might be the last one who still remembers what that purpose feels like from the inside. Drunken styles and a baseline of monstrosity. And part of that purpose, it seems, is expressed in something that would break almost any other figure in this world long before the first blow is even thrown. Kaido does not simply drink, he lives in a shifting weather system of intoxication, drifting from sad drunk to angry drunk to carefree drunk, each mood washing over his enormous frame and tinting his combat style without ever quite dimming the raw power underneath. In his sad, drunk state, you see a creature whose guard appears to lower, whose eyes go distant as if staring at some ancient battlefield only he remembers. Yet even as his posture slackens and his voice grows heavy, the club still falls with the weight to fold Gear 4 Luffy into the ground in a single swing. When the anger rises, that same body tightens. His swings become sharper, his use of Conqueror's haki more deliberate, and the battlefield feels less like a drunken brawl and more like an execution carried out by a wandering storm. Then, there is the carefree drunk, the version of Kaido who laughs, sways, and seems to treat a rooftop war as a kind of rough entertainment, spinning and weaving in the sky with his dragon form, his movements unpredictable and almost playful, yet the damage he inflicts on the scabbards, the supernovas, and even Yamato does not meaningfully diminish. The surface changes, the rhythm changes, the emotional color changes, but the deeper truth of their nature is that his muscles, bones, and scales continue to operate at something close to maximum output. In most stories, alcohol is a debuff, a quiet erosion of timing and focus, a way to show that a fighter is past their prime or taking a battle lightly. With Kaido, it behaves more like a cosmetic filter, never written on any map, never declared in any formal treaty, and never openly acknowledged by those who benefit most from keeping it secret. You are invited to laugh at the wobbling emperor, but the moment his club lands, the world itself reminds you that there exists a hierarchy of strength that does not care whether its participants are sober. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether it is the Uo Uo no Mi's mythical biology knitting his reactions together, or whether his human baseline was already something closer to an ancient weapon given flesh. What we see on Onigashima is a body that refuses to fluctuate in the way ordinary bodies do. His durability, his striking power, his ability to keep fighting through a night of non-stop assaults remain terrifyingly stable. Before you drift into sleep, consider what that implies. If this is Kaido while drunk, emotionally unstable, and half lost in his own memories, what would a fully focused, entirely sober Kaido look like? And has anyone in this quiet, violent world ever truly forced that version to appear? Or is the monster we saw already the relaxed one, holding something even deeper in reserve for a threat that has not yet arrived? Subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories, and if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because from here, we move toward beings whose composure never cracks at all, whose strength is not clouded by drink or doubt, but by an authority so old and so quiet that even Kaido's rampages begin to feel like the tantrums of a younger age. Before sleep takes you, one more gentle invitation. And as we leave that older, quieter authority behind for a moment, the rhythm of the story changes again, not with a shout or a clash, but with the slow realization that your eyes may already be half closed, that the details of Kaido's feats are beginning to blur at the edges, while the feeling of his presence, of his weight in this world, remains. By this point in the night, it is very possible that you are drifting in and out, catching only fragments of Kaido's story and the distant echoes of other monsters standing beside him in that unwritten ranking where there exists a hierarchy of strength that even emperors and admirals must quietly respect. You might remember that they tried to execute him again and again, that blades splintered, that spears bent, that the noose refused to tighten around a neck that would not yield, but the exact numbers and names may already be dissolving into something softer and harder to grasp. You might only hold on to a single image of a vast figure stepping calmly off the edge of a sky island, the wind howling, the ground shattering, and his body simply accepting the impact as if the sea itself had reached up to catch him. In this drowsy space, the facts become a kind of background tide, and what matters is the quiet sense that the world of the story contains beings whose nature bends the rules you thought were firm. Before you drift into sleep, you are welcome, if you wish, to let a small future thread connect you back to this place. Before you drift into sleep, you're welcome to subscribe if you'd like more long, quiet explorations of One Piece's strongest characters. More nights where we walk slowly through emperors and elders, swordsmen and giants, and simply let their power pass over us like a calm, deep wave. Subscribe for more calm One Piece stories, only if it feels gentle and unforced, something you can tap once and then forget as the dark room closes in again. And if you feel like it, Tell me where you're listening from tonight, not as a task, not as a demand, but as a small act of imagination, a way of picturing this story traveling outward into many rooms at once. There might be someone in a high city apartment with traffic murmuring below, someone in a quiet village where the last lights have gone out, someone on a ship or in a dorm or on a couch, all hearing the same names at the same slow pace. In that thought, the viewers become a scattered constellation, never written on any map, never gathered in any harbor, and never seen together, but still faintly connected by this one, shared narrative current. If you never comment, if you never subscribe, if you simply lie there and let the words move past while you say nothing at all, that is more than enough. Your presence here, listening in the dark, is already a kind of answer, a quiet acknowledgement that stories can be a form of company, that even a tale about the strongest creature can be told in a way that soothes rather than stirs. Tonight, we walk slowly through legends of overwhelming force, but the intent is not to rattle your thoughts. It is to give them something steady to rest against while they dim. Because once the surface feats of Kaido's body have been laid out, once we accept that this is a figure who endures where others would break, the mind is naturally drawn toward the deeper truth of their nature. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, and that unanswered space is where the next part of our journey waits, as we turn from what Kaido's body can withstand to the quieter, more unsettling question of where such a creature truly comes from, and what ancient design might have shaped a life that treats death itself as a passing inconvenience. Origins of a beast. Was Kaido born or built? And so, as that idea settles, the focus shifts from what Kaido's body can endure to the quieter riddle of what it actually is and what kind of world would allow such a figure to exist in the first place. In a sea filled with pirates, admirals, giants, and gods, there exists a hierarchy of strength, yet only one being is consistently described not as the strongest man or the strongest pirate, but as the strongest creature, as if the story itself hesitates to file him under any known category of human. The central question unfolds slowly from that single word. Is Kaido's monstrous body the simple result of natural genetics, the product of some harsh and unforgiving bloodline, or did the world carve him into this shape through chains, blades, and laboratories until something fundamentally different stared back at those who tried to control him? The records we are given are sparse but sharp. A child soldier drafted into wars he did not start. A prisoner shuttled between powers who saw him as a weapon first and a person second. A body that kept surviving when, by all ordinary measures, it should have stopped. If you picture that history, not as a series of headlines but as a continuous, unbroken experience, another possibility appears, quiet and unsettling. Perhaps his durability did not arrive all at once, but accumulated, the way a callus forms slowly under constant pressure, then thickens, then hardens until sensation itself seems to withdraw. They hanged him and the rope snapped. They pierced him and the blades bent. They tried to behead him and the execution tools broke. And with each attempt, his body may have adapted a little more, learning in some deep, wordless way that to live in this world meant to refuse every method the world used to end him. Tonight, we walk slowly through a setting where deliberate experimentation is not a myth, but a quiet, recurring reality. Mads dissected the boundaries of biology. Vegapunk and Judge manipulated bloodlines. Artificial fruits spread across the new world. And beings like the Seraphim and Pacifistas stand as proof that flesh and metal, nature and design can be woven together under the authority of those who treat life as a resource. In that context, the idea that Kaido, this living fortress of muscle and scale, might once have been a subject of similar interest does not feel far-fetched, only unspoken. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story. We are never shown a scene of Kaido on an operating table, never given a document that confirms his body was engineered, altered, or awakened by human hands, yet we are also never assured that his strength is purely natural, untouched by science, torture, or ancient design. Before you drift into sleep, it is enough to hold the thought that his origin may be a combination of all three: a brutal childhood, an extraordinary starting point, and the cold curiosity of those who saw an unbreakable child and wondered how far that trait could be pushed. The deeper truth of their nature, for many of the strongest figures in this story, lies just out of reach, and Kaido's beginnings are one of those threads the narrative has not yet chosen to pull. It rests there, quiet in the background, waiting, while we turn our attention to another question entirely. If such a creature walks the world, built or born or something in between, what happens when the next generation begins to approach and perhaps surpass that living benchmark of power? Creature or God? Where does Zoan end and myth begin? And so, as that question about the next generation hangs quietly in the air, another older question rises beneath it, one that belongs to Kaido alone and to the ancient thing he carries inside his body. In this world, there exists a hierarchy of strength, but at its very edges, the categories begin to blur, and what is called a devil fruit starts to look less like a simple ability and more like a compact myth folded into flesh. Mythical Zoans are where that blur becomes almost deliberate, because they are not merely animals given to humans, they are stories given a spine and a heartbeat, turning their users into moving symbols as much as combatants. A normal Zoan makes you a beast, a hybrid, a creature of muscle and instinct. A mythical Zoan makes you an answer to an old tale, a living resolution to something people once whispered about dragons, phoenixes, or gods of the sun. Tonight, we walk slowly through that boundary where the deeper truth of their nature begins to feel less biological and more like a quiet form of worship. Kaido's dragon form is a perfect example of this, because the moment his body lengthens into that vast azure serpent, the atmosphere itself seems to remember an older script. Traditional images of Eastern dragons speak of beings that call storms with a breath, that twist oceans with a gesture, that hang in the sky as arbiters of balance between sea, land, and cloud, and Kaido follows that pattern so closely that his scales feel secondary to the legend they represent. When he coils above Wano and the wind bends around him, when his roar becomes lightning and his presence turns the night sky into a battlefield, his body stops reading as simple flesh and becomes something like a moving story panel stretched across the clouds. By contrast, Luffy's Nika form steps into godhood from the opposite direction, not through terror, but through laughter, elasticity, and the liberation of everyone watching. One is a god of joy and freedom, dancing on rubber ground. The other is a god of fear and overwhelming presence, drinking and descending like a storm that has grown tired of the horizon. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, yet the symmetry is difficult to ignore, and it invites a quiet comparison every time their blows collide above a trembling Onigashima. So, when the world calls Kaido the strongest creature, it may be that the word creature is doing more work than it first appears, carrying not only his muscles and scales and impossible durability, but also the ancient dragon archetype that his devil fruit drapes over his frame. People fear his club, his skin that refuses to break, his refusal to die, yet they also fear the implication that a legend can become a body, that a bedtime story about unstoppable force can one day cast a shadow over your village. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth holding that thought for a moment, because in this light, Kaido becomes less an answer and more a walking question mark, asking where, in One Piece, the line between man, beast, and god truly lies, and whether the next figures to rise will step over that line entirely. Subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories if you feel like it. Tell me where you're listening from tonight, and we will follow that question into the other monsters who wait just beyond Kaido's fading silhouette. The cost of being unkillable: loneliness, boredom, and the search for an end. And as that silhouette fades, the outline that remains is not just of a conqueror, but of a prisoner, held in place not by chains or sea stone, but by his own flesh. There exists a hierarchy of strength in this world, yet at a certain point, strength curves back on itself, and the body that should be a weapon becomes a kind of quiet cage, forcing its owner to walk the same circles of violence again and again, without ever reaching the clean, final stop he keeps throwing himself toward. For Kaido, The executions that failed and the nooses that snapped are not only medals of endurance, they are failed exits, doors that looked like they might finally open and then refused him at the last second. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether it is the ancient dragon fruit, his inhuman lineage, or some deeper truth of their nature that hardens him against the world itself. But the effect is simple to describe and difficult to live with. When cannons, spears, and guillotines all try their best and simply bounce off, it teaches a man that even the world's hatred cannot grant him rest. So he climbs to Sky Islands and steps off the edge, not with the curiosity of an adventurer, but with the weary routine of someone checking once more whether gravity can do what swords could not. Each time the earth breaks, the city shakes, and his body rises again, whole enough to drink, to fight, to command, and in that rising, there is a kind of boredom so deep it almost feels like calm from the outside. Tonight, we walk slowly through that boredom, through the idea that when every battle is survived, every defeat is temporary, and every scar merely another line on an indestructible frame, conflict itself loses its sharpness and becomes a dull, looping background noise. That is why his dream of death is not small. He does not wish to vanish in a quiet alley or slip away in sleep. He speaks instead of a grand war that will shake the world, of a final clash where his fall will mean something, where his unkillable body will finally meet a force that can spend it completely. In a way, his durability has outpaced his purpose, as if his flesh kept running long after his heart found the finish line, leaving him to search for a battlefield worthy of catching up. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth contrasting him with the fragile figures who clutch at life precisely because it can be taken so easily, the sick, the wounded, the ordinary pirates who fear each bullet and blade. They hoard their remaining days while Kaido stands at the opposite extreme, drowning in a surplus of survival he cannot seem to use up, throwing his body at the world the way others throw coins into the sea, hoping one of them finally sinks out of sight. In that sense, his unkillable body is both his greatest strength and his quietest tragedy, the shield that let him seize Onigashima and the weight that kept him from ever putting it down. When we look back on him, beyond feats and titles, what remains is a large, tired question about what it means to be strong in a world where even gods can bleed, and whether the next monsters we meet will be chasing victory, or, like Kaido, simply searching for an end that will finally hold. If Kaido trained, like Katakuri, the monster that might have been. And it is from that large, tired question about Kaido that another, quieter question slowly unfolds. One that does not ask how strong he was, but how different he might have been. Tonight we walk slowly through a version of the world that never made it onto the page, a calm, hypothetical sea where the strongest creature alive chose a path that looked a little less like self-destruction and a little more like discipline. To see that path, the story has already given us a template. Katakuri, standing in the dim light of the mirror world, is a figure built not only on power, but on constant vigilance, strict self-control, and an almost ascetic devotion to observation haki, a man who stays upright for days, who eats in secret so that his composure never cracks, who trains his senses until he can read the flow of battle seconds before it happens. In him, there exists a hierarchy of strength that is not written in titles, but in how completely he has mastered his own nature. Now, the mind drifts, slowly and without urgency, toward the question of what would have happened if Kaido, with that impossible body that shrugged off execution and turned 40 failed beheadings into a dark running joke, had approached himself with the same sobriety and focus. His mythical zone already wrapped an inhuman frame in ancient draconic endurance, letting him fall from sky islands, carve craters into the earth, and rise again with the casual irritation of someone woken from a nap rather than a brush with death. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, but the result is clear. Kaido fights as if pain is a suggestion, not a law, because he can afford to. His style is built on brute force and durability, on letting Gear 4 barrages land, letting scarred samurai carve into him, letting entire alliances exhaust themselves against scales that refuse to yield. He swings his kanabo in wide, devastating arcs, trades blows with emperors and supernovas alike, and rarely bothers to step aside when something dangerous comes his way. Dodging is optional. Minimizing damage is a luxury. The deeper truth of their nature, his and Katakuri's, is that one treats damage as a test to be avoided and the other as a drink to be emptied. Before you drift into sleep, imagine Kaido taking that same monstrous baseline and layering Katakuri's habits on top of it. Constant observation, refined future sight, a mind unclouded by drink, a body that does not just endure hits, but chooses which ones to allow and which ones to let pass like wind. A dragon who rarely needs to tank because he already knows where every attack will land. In a quiet, unsettling way, such a Kaido might have been functionally untouchable for almost anyone in the series, an emperor whose authority over the battlefield extended not just from his club, but from never being where your strike arrived. The story, mercifully or deliberately, never gave us that version. It left him as a tragic blunt instrument, not a polished blade, and left us with an ancient, unresolved what if that can sit at the back of the mind without ever needing a final answer. Yet, as the world of One Piece turns toward new gods, new monsters, and new awakenings, the shadow of that unrealized Kaido lingers, and it quietly asks whether the next creature we meet will waste their body the way he did, or whether somewhere out there, discipline and inhuman potential are finally going to meet. Hidden drawbacks. Does feeling less pain range? How you live, and if discipline and inhuman potential did meet, they would still have to contend with one more quiet complication: what it actually feels like to live inside a body that refuses to break. Kaido is not merely strong in the way a swordsman is strong, or in the way a Logia user is untouchable. He is a figure for whom spears bend, blades shatter, and execution devices fail so consistently that death itself begins to lose its authority. Tonight, we walk slowly through the possibility that this has changed his inner world as much as it has shaped his legend. When a creature has been captured and tortured, has been sentenced to execution more than 40 times, and has watched every attempt slide off his skin like rain off stone, the normal relationship between danger and pain begins to erode. Pain is the quiet signal that tells most people when to stop, when to retreat, when to protect what is fragile. For Kaido, that signal may arrive late, muffled, or not at all. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, whether it lies in his ancient biology or in the Uo no Mi coiled around his spine like a dragon sleeping in its cave. What we can see is the behavior that follows. He stands in front of cannon fire. He lets Gear 4 blows land cleanly. He allows himself to be struck again and again in situations where a more careful emperor would step aside. It is not that he cannot dodge, it is that he has been taught by a lifetime of surviving the unsurvivable that he does not need to. There exists a hierarchy of strength, and he has spent years at the point where even bad habits appear to be rewarded. Yet, the body that does not protest loudly can also hide the deep cost of accumulation. A slash that barely stings, a thunderous impact that feels like a nuisance rather than a threat, still leaves marks beneath the skin, still chips away at stamina and focus, still creates openings that a disciplined opponent can patiently widen. On Onigashima, you can see this quiet arithmetic at work as the scabbards, the supernovas, Yamato, and finally, Luffy layer damage onto a creature that refuses to treat any single blow as urgent. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth considering that this dulled response may reach beyond battle and into his boredom. If ordinary strikes, ordinary pleasures, and even ordinary attempts at suicide all fail to move the needle, then the search for something that finally feels real begins to look less like bravado and more like a weary kind of longing. A fall from a sky island becomes a pastime, not a crisis. The dream of a death that does not bounce off his body becomes, in its own way, a dream of sensation. This is where the deeper truth of their nature often hides, not in the hardness of the skin, but in the choices that such hardness encourages. Kaido's fighting style is broad, overwhelming, and at times careless, leaving gaps that someone like Oden could drive a blade through and that a newly awakened Luffy could exploit with elastic, joyful precision. His body rarely fails him, his judgment does. And so, even the strongest creature alive carries a vulnerability that is not measured in durability, but in the quiet, fateful assumption that he can always afford to take one more hit. If you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, because in the next section we turn from this burden of invulnerability to the opponents who finally forced Kaido to feel its limits, and to the strange calm that comes when a monster realizes he can, at last, fall. A world measured against one body. What Kaido tells us about One Piece. That realization that a monster can fall brings us to a quiet, wider view of the world he stands inside. Tonight we walk slowly through not just Kaido himself, but the way the story has quietly arranged the entire hierarchy of strength around his silhouette. By walking through the top 20 figures in this world, we have seen that there exists a hierarchy of strength that is far from simple, never written on any map, never declared in any formal treaty, and never openly acknowledged by those who benefit from its order. Some, like Mihawk or Rayleigh, express power as pure technique, a blade guided by calm precision. Others, like Big Mom, are walking fortresses whose bodies feel almost geological, more like islands than people. Still others, like Akainu or Enel, manifest elemental authority, turning magma or lightning into extensions of their will, while figures such as Garp or Whitebeard reveal that endurance can be a matter of spirit as much as flesh, a refusal to fall even when the body has already broken. Set against all of these interpretations, Kaido's body sits at a point where many threads converge. The mythical zone he carries does not merely let him become a dragon. It folds an ancient bestial resilience into an already unnatural frame, granting recovery that borders on regeneration, stamina that lets him fight waves of top tiers through a single, unbroken night, and a size that makes even other emperors seem almost compact beside him. Around that, his overwhelming haki wraps like a second skin, a quiet, invisible armor that turns what should be killing, blows from Gear 4, from Ryu-infused swords, from advanced conquerors' clashes, into marks that fade rather than wounds that linger. Because of this, the series uses him as a measuring stick in a way that is unusually direct. If Oden can scar him, Oden is placed, without debate, among the absolute peak of the old era. If the scabbards can force him to his knees, their lifetime of training is instantly recontextualized. If Luffy can finally make him cough blood, the story quietly tells you that the boy who once bounced off Kaido's club has crossed a threshold that words like rookie or supernova can no longer hold. The deeper truth of their nature, these opponents and allies, is revealed by the simple question of whether their attacks can make the strongest creature even notice. When Luffy eventually defeats him, the intent is not to strip that title away, but to show how far reality itself must bend for such a thing to occur. Gear 5 feels less like a technique and more like the world for a brief moment agreeing to treat Luffy as a cartoon, allowing him to twist lightning, reshape the ground, and laugh in the face of what should be terminal exhaustion. The question of how this is possible has not been fully answered by the story, and in that gap, Kaido's status remains strangely intact. If anything, the mountain looks taller when you see how strange the sky had to become just to step over it. In this sense, his body stops feeling like a single character trait and becomes a narrative instrument, a quiet tool the manga uses to ask how far strength can go before it stops feeling human at all, before a figure ceases to be a man and becomes a natural disaster with a name. Before you drift into sleep, it is worth noticing that nearly everyone we have placed near the top has, in some way, been compared to Kaido, either explicitly or in the quiet math of their feats, and in the next section we will turn that lens outward to see how his fall reshapes the balance of power for those ancient, watching authorities above the sea. Subscribe for more calm One Piece stories, and if you feel like it, Tell me where you're listening from tonight, because the world that forms in the shadow of a fallen dragon is not necessarily a safer one. Drifting back to shore, letting the monsters fade into the dark. The world that forms in the shadow of that fallen dragon does not need to stay sharp in your mind. It can begin to soften now, the edges of each name and title loosening, the arguments about who truly stands above whom sinking back beneath the quiet surface of your thoughts. Tonight, we walk slowly through the memory of where we have been, not to reopen the debates, but to let them drift. We passed first through the realm of disciplined humans, figures like Katakuri, whose power comes from relentless training, from a body honed by effort rather than miracle, a man who turns mochi and foresight into a kind of living armor. From there, the story carried us toward living disasters, toward Big Mom, whose very nature feels like a natural calamity, and Whitebeard, who shook the seas themselves even as his body failed him, and finally to Kaido, whose frame seemed to reject the very idea of being killed at all. There exists a hierarchy of strength in this world, but you do not need to hold its exact order in your hands anymore. You can let Katakuri, Big Mom, Whitebeard, Kaido, and all the others become distant shapes on the inner horizon, not crisp portraits with numbers attached, but silhouettes that slowly fade into a shared dusk. The question of who was truly second or third or barely outside the top 10 can dissolve, as if the rankings were written on wet sand and the tide has finally come in. Before you drift into sleep, it is perfectly all right if you have already forgotten which feet belong to which figure, or how many times Kaido was captured, or how long Whitebeard remained standing. The purpose of this quiet journey was never to test your memory, but to walk slowly through a world where strength takes many forms, where the deeper truth of their nature lies not only in numbers and tears, but in the calm recognition that endurance, sacrifice, authority, and will each leave different marks on the sea. You are allowed to rest alongside those images without cataloging them. If you picture the rooftop of Onigashima now, you may notice how empty it has become. The storm clouds that once framed that battlefield begin to part. The dragon that coiled through the sky has already fallen away into legend, and what remains is only broken stone, a thinning mist, and the quiet wind tracing gentle paths where weapons once clashed. The voices are gone, the thunder has stopped answering their blows, and somewhere far below, the sound of distant waves returns to its slow, patient rhythm. As the monsters fade into the dark, what remains is a simple sea, calm and deep, a place where nothing needs to be ranked or proven anymore, where no execution records are kept and no bounty posters flutter in the air. In that water, Kaido is no longer the strongest creature, Big Mom is no longer a living disaster, Whitebeard is no longer the man who could destroy the world. They are all just stories dissolving into the same tide, and yet, in the quiet that follows, another kind of presence begins to stir beneath the surface, a different shape of power that does not announce itself with roars at all. Until the next voyage, a final whisper and gentle goodbye. That presence does not need to shout or conquer or split the sky. It moves quietly in the space between thoughts, in the way a mind that has been following a hierarchy of strength for so long finally begins to loosen its grip on names and numbers and feats. In that calm after the last clash, even the strongest creature becomes, once more, just a figure drifting slowly through the wider sea of the story. In this quiet place, thank you for staying with this voyage, for spending this gentle stretch of time exploring Kaido's body and the world's strongest characters, whether your eyes are still open or whether you drifted away halfway through and are only catching fragments now. Strength has been measured, compared, turned over from every angle, yet the deeper truth of their nature is that, in the end, they are simply shapes of power moving through an imagined world, here to give your thoughts something soft and distant to follow as the real one grows dim. Tonight, we walk slowly through these last moments together, not to add one more ranking, not to argue over who truly deserves which place, but to let the noise of conflict fade until only a low, steady echo remains. Before you drift into sleep, you are welcome, if it feels right, to let this be enough. No more analysis, no more questions, only the lingering image of Kaido's silhouette against a moonlit sky, then even that dissolving into the dark. If you would like more long, atmospheric One Piece stories to fall asleep to, you are always welcome to return here to let another quiet hierarchy of strength unfold at its own slow pace, or, if it feels comfortable, to subscribe for more calm, One Piece stories without any urgency at all. The channel will be here whenever you need company, a small point of light in the background of your night, asking nothing from you except that you breathe and listen and rest. And if you feel like it, tell me where you're listening from tonight, not as a demand, but as a soft invitation to imagine a scattered crew of late-night viewers spread across cities and villages and silent rooms, all floating on the same calm ocean of sound. Somewhere, another listener is hearing these words at the very same moment, unknown to you, unnamed, yet quietly connected by this shared passing current. Now, you can let the structure go. There is no more list to follow, no more figures to compare, only thoughts that loosen and drift like a small boat on a still Grand Line night, turning slowly with the tide, guided by nothing more than the gentle pull of sleep. Until the next voyage, rest well and let the silence that follows carry you the rest of the way.